My name is Naomi, 32 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful software developer, I escaped their toxicity but maintained occasional contact. Last Sunday, they invited me to an upscale brunch to catch up. Between mimosas and avocado toast, my mother leaned forward smirking. You know, Charmaine, you are lucky we even include you. Pity goes a long way. I simply sipped my coffee and smiled. That night, I logged in, disabled every family credit account, and emailed my lawyer about selling the cabin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Fairfield, Connecticut meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our four-bedroom house with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom, painted pale blue at my mother Elaine's insistence, despite my preference for green, became my sanctuary and prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight A's, joined honor societies, and volunteered at the local library just to hear a passing acknowledgement from my parents. My brother Troy was the star of the family, the one who could do no wrong in our father's eyes, even when he crashed the family car or failed his advanced placement exams. I was the one who had to be perfect just to earn a seat at the dinner table. When I finally left for college and eventually landed a high-paying job in tech, they didn't see my success. They saw a resource they could leverage. My mother in particular was an expert at making me feel small while constantly reminding me that I owed them for my upbringing. I had learned to navigate their games, but the recent months had pushed me to my breaking point. Now let us shift to the night everything finally snapped. The dining room at Belmont's in Buckhead was vibrating with the kind of high society energy that my mother-in-law Vivian craved more than air itself. It was the place to be seen, the place where the elite of Atlanta gathered to confirm their status over gold-plated cutlery and imported wine. Vivian was celebrating her 62nd birthday, and she had invited 15 people, including her favorite church elders, my husband Julian, his sister Kendra, her husband Darius, and a collection of sycophants who hung on her every word. Julian was in his element, playing the part of the successful financier, ordering top-shelf champagne and making grand pronouncements about his latest investment deals, none of which had actually yielded a profit. I sat at the far end of the table, quiet, observant, and feeling completely out of place in this theater of vanity. I had spent 6 years building a career in software development that required actual skill, unlike the performative lifestyle my husband curated on his Instagram feed. My contributions to our life were substantial, but to this group I was simply the quiet wife who paid the bills while they spent the money. When the dessert menu was cleared, the waiter arrived with a heavy leather folder that contained the damage for the evening. It was a staggering $4,700. The amount was almost entirely composed of the expensive vintage wine Julian had insisted on ordering to impress his mother's friends. Julian didn't even glance at the total. He grabbed the folder with a flourish, his face split by a wide, confident grin. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the American Express black card, the one I had opened as the primary holder for our household and business expenses. He slid it across the white tablecloth, his body language signaling that he was the man who had it all. The waiter took the card with a polite nod and vanished toward the terminal at the edge of the room. Julian went back to recounting an exaggerated story about a meeting he had in New York, his voice loud enough to command the attention of the entire table. Vivian was leaning in, hanging on his every word, her eyes gleaming with the reflected light of the crystal chandelier. It was the perfect moment of theater, until the waiter returned, walking with a noticeably different gait. He stopped beside Julian, his expression carefully neutral, but with a hint of professional discomfort. "I am terribly sorry, sir," the waiter said, his voice just loud enough for the people seated near Julian to hear. "The card has been declined." Julian froze. He blinked once, then chuckled clearly, thinking it was some kind of computer error. "That is impossible. Try it again. Please, there must be a glitch." The waiter tapped his tablet again, his posture stiffening as the machine emitted a sharp, error-filled beep. "Sir, I am afraid the card is locked. It is not a matter of funds, it is a restricted status." Julian turned toward me, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. The smug confidence that had been plastered on his face just seconds ago vanished, replaced by a raw, naked embarrassment. He hissed across the table, his eyes darting to the church elders, who were now watching us with curious, judging gazes. "Sasha, what did you do? You forgot to pay the balance again. This is beyond humiliating." I calmly took a sip of my sparkling water, my pulse steady. I knew exactly what I had done and why. I leaned forward, keeping my voice low so only he and the nearest guests could hear. "No, Julian. I didn't forget anything. I locked that card myself early this morning, right after I spent 3 hours going through the digital statements." His eyes widened in panic. "You did what?" "Why?" "Because I finally had enough of the bleeding." I answered, my tone razor sharp. "I checked the statement logs. I saw that your mother used it to buy 3 Telfar bags in 1 week, and I saw that deposit she put down on the Porsche for Darius last month. I am not funding their lifestyle anymore." The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Vivian, Kendra, and Darius, who had been laughing moments before, were now staring at me in total shock. Julian looked as though I had just struck him. He stammered, looking at his mother, then back at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He desperately pulled out his own personal Visa and MasterCards, fumbling as he tried to hand them to the waiter. But I knew those were already at their limit from the reckless spending he had engaged in over the last few months. I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my dress. I reached into my purse, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and set it firmly on the table. "That is for my salad and water. The rest of the bill is on you, Julian. Consider it a birthday gift from the family you seem to love so much more than your own wife." I grabbed my clutch, turned, and walked toward the exit. Behind me, the restaurant manager was already approaching, his face stern. I didn't look back. I didn't slow down. I walked out of that restaurant and into the cool Atlanta air, feeling a rush of adrenaline that I hadn't felt in years. The long drive back to our home was the first moment I had to reflect on the explosion I had just ignited. I knew that Julian would be furious, and that Vivian would likely start a smear campaign the moment she got home, but the satisfaction of standing my ground outweighed the fear of their reaction. I thought about the months of subtle manipulation, the way Julian had convinced me that helping his family was simply part of being a team, the way Vivian had invaded my private spaces and assumed my resources were her playground. It had been a slow erosion of my boundaries, a gradual process of being made to feel like my own money was a community resource. I remembered back to the time Julian had asked me to put his mother on our account. He had used a tone of such gentle concern. "Sasha, Vivian is having some health issues, and it's just too much stress for her to worry about bank transfers when she needs to get to her appointments. If she has a card, she can just pay the specialist directly without waiting for reimbursement." It sounded so noble, so helpful. I was the VP of PR, a woman who analyzed the spin on billion-dollar brands, yet I had let my own husband spin me into a corner where I was financing his sister's lifestyle and his mother's shopping addiction. The realization was both stinging and empowering. I had been playing the role of the quiet, accommodating wife, and look where it had gotten me, publicly humiliated at a birthday dinner by a bill I didn't even rack up. I arrived at the house we shared, the house that now felt more like a tomb of a failed marriage. I didn't turn on the lights. I walked straight to my office, the small, dimly lit room where I did my best work. I opened my laptop and saw the familiar icon for my private savings account. I clicked on it, seeing the balance was still secure, untouched by Julian's grubby fingers. I had started that account the week after we got married, a small act of rebellion that I had kept secret all this time. It was a modest amount, but it was enough to get me through a transition. I began drafting an email to Elias, the forensic accountant, who had been helping me track the inconsistencies I had noticed in our joint account. I needed him to help me untangle the legal mess Julian had created, not just with the cards, but with our shared savings and the potential tax fraud Vivian had been dipping into. My life was about to become a battleground, but for the first time in 3 years, I felt like the commander, not the casualty. As I sat in the darkness waiting for Julian to return, I thought about the path that had led me here. I had come from a neighborhood where survival was the primary goal, where every dollar counted, and every mistake felt like a cliff edge. I had worked my way up from a junior intern to a position of power in one of the toughest industries in the country. I hadn't built this life just to be a silent funder for a woman who thought I was an outsider, or for a man who viewed me as a paycheck. The silence in the house was soon broken by the sound of Julian's car pulling into the driveway. He wasn't going to be pleasant. He was going to be an erupting volcano, and for the first time I wasn't going to be the one who tried to put out the fire. I watched through the window as he stormed up the porch steps, his gait uneven and his body language aggressive. I sat in my chair and turned on the desk lamp, waiting for him to push the front door open. He would likely start with shouting, then move to blaming me for his failure, and finally try to guilt-trip me into unlocking the account. He was in for a very long, very painful night. I checked my phone to ensure the recording app was already running. I didn't want any of his threats to vanish into the thin air of his denial. This wasn't just about a birthday dinner anymore. It was about the slow, deliberate destruction of the life he thought he had successfully controlled. He entered the house, his voice booming as he called my name, but I didn't answer. I wanted him to come to me. I wanted to see the look on his face when he realized that the game had permanently changed. He reached the office and kicked the door open. His tie was undone, and he looked disheveled, the picture of a man who had just lost everything he valued most, his reputation. I stared at him, my expression blank, my heart rate steady. He was going to try to break me, but I knew something he didn't. I was already broken, and in the process of putting the pieces back together, I had forged something much harder than anything he could possibly hope to crack. The battle for my independence had officially moved into its next phase, and I was holding all the cards even if he didn't know it yet. Julian had completely wiped out the foundation of our future. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. $150,000. Gone. Evaporated into the digital ether. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes tracing the details of the transaction log. The wire transfer had been executed on a Tuesday afternoon, right in the middle of my biggest press junket of the quarter. He knew I would be distracted. He knew I wouldn't be checking my personal banking alerts while managing a hospitality crisis for a billionaire client. It was a calculated, deliberate strike. The destination routing number belonged to a regional bank that I knew we had no accounts with. The memo line on the transfer simply read, "Investment Capital Transfer." I grabbed my phone and immediately dialed Elias. It was barely 6:15 in the morning, but Elias was the kind of man who viewed sleep as a mild inconvenience. He answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and alert. "Elias," I said, skipping any pleasantries. "He drained the joint savings. All of it. $150,000 wired out 3 days ago." I heard the rapid clicking of a keyboard on his end of the line. "Give me the destination routing number and the exact timestamp of the transfer." I read the numbers off the screen, my voice remarkably steady despite the hurricane of panic and rage swirling inside me. "Give me 20 minutes, Sasha," Elias replied. "Do not confront him. Do not change your passwords yet. Act completely normal. If he knows you have seen the zero balance, he might try to move the money again or destroy the paper trail. I will call you back." He hung up, leaving me in the chilling silence of my office. Act normal. The directive felt nearly impossible, but I knew Elias was right. In the world of high-stakes crisis management, losing your composure is exactly how you lose the war. I had to treat Julian not as my husband, but as a hostile corporate entity that had just breached my firewall. I closed the banking portal, cleared my browser history, and walked quietly into the master bedroom. I changed into my sleekest, most intimidating power suit, a charcoal gray ensemble that made me look like armor plating. I applied my makeup with meticulous precision, masking the exhaustion of a sleepless night. I needed to look untouchable. By the time Julian emerged from the guest room at 7:30, I was sitting at the kitchen island, calmly sipping a fresh cup of coffee and scrolling through industry emails on my iPad. He shuffled into the kitchen, looking haggard. The bravado from the previous night's tantrum had faded, leaving behind a sullen, defensive posture. He poured himself a cup of coffee without looking at me, his shoulders hunched. "Did you call American Express?" he mumbled, taking a sip from his mug. I did not look up from my screen. "I will handle the finances today, Julian. You just focus on getting to work." He mistook my calm tone for submission. He let out a long, arrogant sigh, leaning against the counter. "See? That is all I asked for, Sasha. Just be a partner. We are going to have a long talk tonight about respect and boundaries. But I am glad you are finally seeing reason. My mother was humiliated, and I expect you to make it right." I offered a tight, closed-lipped smile. "Oh, I plan to make everything exactly right." He nodded, satisfied with his own perceived victory, and walked out the door to head to his mid-level analyst job. The moment I heard his car pull out of the driveway, my phone rang. It was Elias. "I have the paper trail," Elias said, his tone grim. "And Sasha, it is much worse than a bad investment." I sat down on one of the leather bar stools. "Tell me." The money was wired to a commercial account registered to an LLC called Apex Legacy Holdings, Elias explained. I pulled the state registry documents. The sole proprietor of Apex Legacy Holdings is Darius, my brother-in-law, the man who had not held a legitimate job since the Obama administration, the man who wore designer sneakers while dodging calls from collection agencies. Julian gave Darius our entire savings. I asked, the sheer absurdity of it making my head spin. "Why?" "It gets deeper." Elias continued, the rapid clicking of his keyboard echoing over the phone. "Apex Legacy Holdings isn't an investment firm. It's a shell company. Darius has been using it to float high-interest loans from some very unsavory private lenders. He was trying to flip a dilapidated commercial property in South Atlanta, but he defaulted on the hard money loans. The lenders were threatening to pursue him criminally for fraud. Julian didn't invest your money, Sasha. He paid off Darius's loan sharks to keep his brother-in-law out of prison." I closed my eyes, pressing 2 fingers to the bridge of my nose. A dull, pulsing headache began to form behind my eyes. Julian had stolen my money to save a grifter. He had sacrificed our future to protect the fake image of his family's success. "There is one more thing," Elias said, his voice dropping an octave. "The transfer wasn't direct. The $150,000 didn't go straight from your joint account to Darius's shell company. It hit an intermediary account first." "Whose account?" "It went through a digital payment portal registered to your mother-in-law's megachurch, the Prosperity Tabernacle." I stood up my chair, scraping loudly against the tile floor. Vivian's church. Why would Julian route the money through a church portal? Because Vivian facilitated it. Elias explained, mapping out the devastating reality. Julian routed the money as a charitable donation under Vivian's name. The church then issued a grant from their community development fund directly to Apex Legacy Holdings. Vivian used your life savings to make herself look like a top-tier platinum-level donor to her congregation. She bought her status as a church elder with your money and then washed the funds clean to bail out Darius. Tax fraud, money laundering, wire fraud. The list of federal crimes was expanding by the second. My mother-in-law had literally used my bank account to buy her way into the kingdom of heaven while keeping her deadbeat son-in-law out of a federal penitentiary. "I need you to come to my office right now," Elias commanded. "Bring every hard drive, every bank statement, and every piece of mail you can find with Julian's name on it. We are not just filing for divorce, Sasha. We are building a RICO case." I hung up the phone. The shock had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. They thought I was just a walking ATM. They thought they could use my success, launder my money, and then gaslight me into apologizing for their theft. I walked into Julian's home office. He kept his important documents in a locked steel filing cabinet in the corner. He had always told me it contained sensitive client data and that I was never to open it. I went to the garage, retrieved a heavy crowbar from my toolkit, and walked back to his office. I jammed the flat end of the crowbar under the lip of the top drawer and threw my entire body weight into it. The cheap metal groaned, then snapped with a loud crack. The drawer slid open, revealing neat stacks of manila folders. I began tossing folders onto the floor, scanning titles, tax returns, old bank statements. Then I found a thick file labeled Property Deeds. I opened it, expecting to see the standard paperwork for the home we currently shared. Instead, I saw the deed to my premarital home, a beautiful townhome I had purchased 5 years before I even met Julian, a property I rented out to cover its own mortgage. Attached to the deed was a document from a major national bank. It was an approval letter for a home equity line of credit. A HELOC. The approval amount was $250,000. I stared at the paperwork, my vision tunneling. The loan was approved. The funds had been dispersed 2 months ago. I flipped to the signature page. There at the bottom of the contract was my name, Sasha Marie Jenkins. But it was not my handwriting. The loops were wrong. The pressure was heavy and jagged. Julian had forged my signature. He had committed identity theft to take out $250,000 in debt against the only asset I owned, completely outright. He had leveraged my past, my present, and my future to fund his family's delusions of grandeur. And according to the payment schedule attached to the back of the file, the first major balloon payment was due in exactly 30 days. If it was not paid, the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings on my townhome. He hadn't just stolen from me, he had orchestrated my financial execution. I stood in the dead silence of his home office with the forged bank documents trembling in my hands. The man I had promised to spend the rest of my life with had methodically planned my absolute ruin. I did not scream or throw the heavy filing drawer across the room. In my line of work as a public relations executive, panic is a luxury reserved for the unprepared. When a billionaire client faces a scandal, we do not cry. We gather the data, we secure the perimeter, and we prepare the counteroffensive. I was now my own most important client. I pulled my phone from my pocket and systematically photographed every single page in the folder. I captured the fraudulent signature, the routing numbers, the approval stamps, and the payment schedules. I made sure the lighting was perfect, so there could be no deniability. Once I had a complete digital record safely backed up to my encrypted cloud storage, I carefully placed the physical folder back into the broken drawer. I could not hide the damage from the crowbar, so I simply left the drawer slightly ajar, a silent monument to the trust that had just been shattered. I needed professional backup. I immediately contacted Elias. Elias was a ruthless forensic accountant and attorney I frequently utilized in my corporate crisis management network. He was the kind of man who could find a missing dollar in a maze of international shell companies, and he possessed the moral flexibility required to destroy people who deserved it. I called him on my drive to his downtown office, giving him a brief overview of the disaster. By the time I arrived, he had already prepared a secure war room. Elias reviewed the digital photographs of the home equity line of credit on his massive monitor. His face remained completely impassive, a mask of professional calculation. "This is federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft, Sasha," he said. "He took out $250,000 against your premarital property. If this balloon payment is missed in 30 days, the bank will initiate foreclosure. But there is a missing puzzle piece. We need to know exactly how he views his actions to understand his legal defense strategy." I sat across from him, my hands folded tightly in my lap. "The joint savings account is completely drained," I told him. "The $150,000 we were supposed to use for our new investment property was wiped out 3 days ago." Elias leaned forward, his dark eyes sharp. "We have the paper trail for the forgery, but we need his verbal confirmation regarding the cash. If he claims you gave him verbal authorization to move the savings, it becomes a messy," he said. "She said scenario in civil court. We need him on the record, admitting he took unilateral action. I need you to go back to that house, play the part of the panicked, submissive wife, and confront him about the missing cash. Let him talk. Arrogant men always give themselves away when they think they are the smartest person in the room. I left Elias's office with a clear mission and a heart turned entirely to ice. I drove back to our suburban home just as the evening sun began to cast long shadows across the manicured lawns. Julian's luxury sedan was parked in the driveway, a vehicle he insisted we needed to project the right image to his clients, despite the fact that I made the payments on it. I walked through the front door, switching my phone to voice memo mode and slipping it deep into my jacket pocket. I found Julian in the kitchen. He was casually pouring himself a glass of expensive bourbon, looking completely relaxed. The humiliation he had suffered at his mother's birthday dinner when the black card was declined seemed entirely forgotten, replaced by his usual veneer of unearned confidence. "Julian," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calibrated to sound anxious and overwhelmed. "I just logged into our joint savings account to check our balance for the new property closing. It is completely empty. Where is the $150,000? He did not flinch. He did not drop his glass or look guilty. He simply took a slow, deliberate sip of his bourbon and turned to face me. He leaned against the granite counter, looking at me with a mixture of amusement and annoyance, as if I were a child interrupting an important business meeting. "I moved it," he said, his voice entirely devoid of remorse. "I put it into a high-yield, low-risk real estate venture." I stared at him, forcing my expression to remain confused and frightened while my blood boiled. "You moved our entire life savings without discussing it with me." "What real estate venture? We already had a property selected." "It is a private commercial development deal, managed by Darius Julian," replied smoothly, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "They are acquiring distressed commercial properties in the metropolitan area, renovating them and flipping them for massive profits. The returns are going to be exponential." I needed to move fast to secure our equity stake before the window closed. "You were busy with your public relations clients, and honestly, Sasha, you do not understand the aggressive mechanics of commercial real estate investment." "You gave our life savings to your brother?" I asked, letting my voice tremble naturally as the sheer audacity of his lie hit me. "Darius does not even have a real estate license. He has never developed a property in his life. He lives in a leased apartment that we help pay for." Julian slammed his glass down on the counter, the sharp sound echoing through the large kitchen. He stepped toward me, using his height to loom over me, a classic intimidation tactic he had used whenever I questioned his financial decisions. "Stop being hysterical, Sasha. You are overreacting as usual and making a massive issue out of standard investment procedures. I am a financial analyst. I look at market trends, venture capital, and risk assessments all day long. I know exactly what I am doing. You need to trust my financial expertise. This is how generational wealth is built. We have to be aggressive, and we have to trust our blood." He was actively gaslighting me right to my face. He stood there in our kitchen demanding I trust his financial expertise, knowing full well he had wired that money to a shell company. He wasn't just an enabler of his family's toxic behavior anymore. I looked at him and realized my husband was a predator. He was actively stealing from me, draining my hard-earned wealth to fund his family's fake high society image, and he felt entirely justified in doing so. I took a step back, wrapping my arms around myself to play the part of the submissive, intimidated wife. "I am just worried, Julian. That was all our liquid cash. What if something goes wrong with Darius's project?" "Nothing is going to go wrong unless you ruin it with your constant negativity," he sneered, adjusting his shirt cuffs. "My family supported me so I could get where I am. It is our duty to take care of them and bring them up with us. You are acting like a selfish, ungrateful woman who forgot her roots just because you got a little corporate title. Darius is going to double our money in 6 months. Just calm down and let the men handle the business, Sasha." I looked down at the hardwood floor, nodding slowly as my hidden phone recorded every single word of his damning confession. "Okay," I whispered, keeping my tone perfectly defeated. "I trust you." He scoffed, picking his glass back up. "See that you do. I am going up to the guest room. I have actual work to prepare for tomorrow, and I do not want to deal with your unnecessary drama tonight. I waited until I heard his heavy footsteps climb the stairs and the guest bedroom door click firmly shut. Only then did I pull my phone from my pocket and stop the recording. My hands were perfectly steady. I uploaded the audio file to my secure server and forwarded it directly to Elias. The trap had been successfully sprung. Julian had just handed us recorded proof of his unilateral transfer of joint assets under false pretenses. He had explicitly named Darius as the manager of the funds and admitted to moving the money without my prior knowledge or consent. I walked back into my home office and locked the door behind me. I opened my laptop and waited. I knew Elias was already dissecting the recording, comparing Julian's arrogant claims against the actual digital paper trail we had uncovered earlier. The silence of the house felt different now. It was no longer the silence of a failing marriage, but the quiet of a battlefield just before the artillery strikes. Nearly an hour later, an encrypted email notification popped up on my screen. It was from Elias. The subject line simply read, "Urgent update." I opened the message and read the report Elias had generated based on Julian's recorded claims and the routing numbers from the joint account. Elias had run a deep forensic trace on Apex Legacy Holdings, the supposed high-yield, low-risk real estate venture Darius was allegedly managing. Elias did not just find a simple grift, he uncovered a massive, glaring red flag that tied the entire fraudulent operation together in a way that defied belief. Darius's shell company was not just paying off local private lenders or funding fake development deals. Elias tracked the secondary wire transfers leaving Apex Legacy Holdings. The bulk of my $150,000 had been immediately washed through the LLC and wired out of the country entirely. The funds had been deposited into an offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands. I scrolled down to the final attachment in Elias's report. It was the registration documentation for the offshore account. The primary beneficiary and sole signatory on that hidden Caribbean account was not Darius. It was not his loan sharks or his fake business partners. It was Julian. The revelation struck me with the force of a freight train. Julian was not just bailing his brother out of trouble. He was using Darius as a complex smokescreen to systematically launder my money and siphon it into a private, untraceable account for himself. He was preparing his own golden parachute, building a secret fortune funded entirely by my destruction. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal kept me awake until the sun began to bleach the horizon. By 8 o'clock the next morning, I was pulling into the underground parking garage of Elias's downtown firm. I bypassed the sleek reception area and headed straight for the secure sub-basement suite he used for highly classified corporate forensic investigations. Elias was already waiting. His office looked like a war room. The walls were lined with frosted glass whiteboards covered in complex flowcharts, bank routing numbers, and interconnected red lines. The large mahogany conference table was buried under stacks of printed bank statements, LLC registration forms, and tax documents. Elias did not offer me coffee or pleasantries. He simply pointed to the chair opposite him and slid a thick manila folder across the polished wood. "I need you to look at the physical paper trail, Sasha," he said, his voice dropping into the clinical detached tone he used when dismembering corporate fraud rings. What we discussed last night was just the digital footprint. Seeing the actual signed documents brings the entire criminal conspiracy into sharp focus. I opened the folder. The first document was the incorporation paperwork for Apex Legacy Holdings. Darius had registered the shell company 3 years ago, listing a defunct strip mall as its primary corporate address. "Darius is the registered agent," Elias explained, tapping a silver pen against the document. "But he has absolutely no operational control over the capital. He is a straw man. He needed quick cash to cover his escalating debts, and Julian needed a disposable idiot to act as the fall guy if the feds ever audited the transfers." I flipped to the next page, which displayed a terrifyingly long list of aggressive high-interest loans. Darius had borrowed heavily from a syndicate of unregulated private lenders operating out of Nevada. These were not traditional banks. They were predatory organizations that charged exorbitant interest rates and employed aggressive extra-legal collection tactics. Darius was drowning, Elias stated flatly. He defaulted on 3 separate bridge loans. These lenders were preparing to seize everything he owned and likely press criminal charges for fraudulent loan applications. Julian used $75,000 of your savings to pay off those loan sharks. He bought his brother's freedom using your sweat equity. I stared at the transfer receipts, my chest tight with a suffocating rage. Julian had stolen from me to save a man who had never worked a legitimate day in his life. But it was the second half of the equation that truly showcased the sinister brilliance of Julian's scheme. And the rest of the money, I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The offshore account you found last night. Elias pulled up a fresh schematic on the massive digital monitor mounted on the wall. That is where your mother-in-law enters the picture, he said. He tapped his keyboard, and the logo for Prosperity Tabernacle, the sprawling, obscenely wealthy megachurch Vivian attended, flashed onto the screen. Vivian was a fixture at that church. She wore designer hats, sat in the reserved VIP pews, and frequently boasted about her spiritual superiority at our family dinners. Julian could not just wire $150,000 directly to an offshore account without triggering massive red flags with the IRS. Elias explained, pacing the length of the conference table. Any transfer over $10,000 is flagged. He needed a washing machine. He needed an institution with tax-exempt status that did not have to report incoming donations with the same rigorous transparency as a commercial bank. I felt the blood drain from my face. He used Vivian's church. Exactly, Elias said, his dark eyes locked on mine. Vivian facilitated the entire transaction. Julian wired the money to a donor portal linked directly to her name. Vivian then officially donated your life savings to the church's community development fund. She gave my money to the church, I asked, struggling to comprehend the sheer audacity of the crime. She donated it, Elias corrected, but with a highly specific, legally binding stipulation. The church offers a grant program for minority-owned real estate development. Vivian used her leverage as a top-tier donor to ensure the church immediately awarded a community development grant to Apex Legacy Holdings. The church acted as an unwitting pass-through entity. They took the money in as a tax-deductible charitable donation from Vivian and pushed it right back out to Darius's shell company as a grant. I sat back in my chair, staring blindly at the whiteboard. The layers of deception were staggering. Vivian had conspired with her sons to steal my money. She had weaponized her religion to commit felony wire fraud. And there is a secondary benefit for your mother-in-law, Elias added, leaning forward and resting his hands on the table. By funneling your money through her personal donor profile, Vivian instantly elevated her status within the congregation. She is now classified as a platinum-level benefactor. She gets exclusive access to the pastor prime seating at every gala and the absolute adoration of her peers. She bought her high society church socialite persona using your stolen money. And the tax deduction, I realized the puzzle pieces finally snapping together in my mind. Elias nodded sharply. Precisely. Vivian will claim a massive charitable deduction on her taxes this year, drastically reducing her tax liability. She is literally profiting off the theft of your savings. Once the clean grant money hit Apex Legacy Holdings, Darius paid off the loan sharks, and Julian quietly swept the remaining $75,000 into his Cayman Islands account. It is a textbook money laundering operation. I closed the folder, running my hands over the smooth cardboard cover. My mother-in-law, a woman who quoted scripture to me while criticizing my career choices, was a common thief. My husband, who demanded I respect his financial expertise, was a calculating criminal preparing to abandon me. They had looked me in the eye, eaten food I paid for, lived in a house I maintained, all while methodically stripping me of everything I had worked for. "We have them," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I looked up at Elias. "This is irrefutable proof. The routing numbers the church grants the offshore accounts. It is all right here." "We do," Elias confirmed. "I have compiled a comprehensive dossier. If I hand this over to my contacts at the FBI Financial Crimes Division and the IRS Criminal Investigation Unit, Julian and Darius will be facing decades in federal prison. Vivian will be indicted for tax fraud and conspiracy. Her assets will be frozen, and she will be publicly disgraced. I took a deep breath, the air filling my lungs with a sudden intoxicating sense of power. I had spent years walking on eggshells around these people, trying to earn their respect, trying to prove I was worthy of their family. I had tolerated Julian's arrogance, Vivian's condescension, and Darius's endless grifting. I had paid the black tax willingly, believing I was supporting a family that loved me. Instead, I was funding a criminal enterprise. I want to destroy them. I said the words tasting like copper in my mouth. I want them to lose everything. I want Vivian's church friends to know exactly who she is. I want Julian dragged out of his office in handcuffs. Elias offered a rare, predatory smile. I can arrange that, Sasha. But we must be strategic. If we drop the hammer now, they will scramble. They might try to move the offshore funds or destroy localized evidence. We need to lock them into a public venue, a place where they cannot run, where their entire social facade is on display. We need maximum exposure to ensure the collateral damage to their reputations is absolute. I nodded, my mind racing through the upcoming social calendar. The Atlanta Black Excellence Gala was approaching. Vivian was slated to receive a philanthropic award undoubtedly secured by her fraudulent donations. It was the premier event of the season, crawling with press, politicians, and the city's elite. It would be the perfect stage for a public execution. Before I could articulate the plan to Elias, my phone violently vibrated against the mahogany table. I glanced down at the screen. The notification center was an absolute wall of text messages, missed calls, and social media alerts. My phone was practically seizing with incoming data. I frowned and picked it up, swiping open my home screen. The first message was from my older sister, a woman who rarely involved herself in my marital affairs. Her text read simply, "Sasha, what on earth is happening? Have you seen Vivian's Facebook page? Call me right now." A second message popped up from a close friend in my public relations network. "Sasha, do not respond publicly. I am pulling the social listening metrics now. It is bad." I opened my social media applications and my stomach plummeted into my shoes. Vivian had not waited for me to make the next move. She had realized the danger of the locked black card and the escalating tension, and she had launched a devastating, coordinated, preemptive strike. My feed was dominated by a lengthy, emotionally manipulative post written by Vivian and shared by Kendra Darius and dozens of church members. It was a masterclass in character assassination. Vivian had painted a heartbreaking picture of a devoted family struggling to support an increasingly unstable and cruel daughter-in-law. She claimed I was suffering from a severe mental breakdown brought on by corporate stress. She told the entire congregation and her elite social circles that I had suddenly and viciously cut off funding for her vital medical treatments, freezing her accounts out of sheer spite. She painted Julian as a long-suffering, devoted husband, desperately trying to hold our marriage together, while I financially abused him and threatened to leave his elderly mother homeless. The post was currently sitting at over 400 shares. The comment section was a cesspool of outrage directed entirely at me. Women I had hosted for brunch, people I thought were my friends, were leaving messages offering prayers for Julian and condemning my supposedly toxic behavior. Vivian had weaponized her congregation, turning the entire city's social elite against me in a matter of hours. She had struck first, seeking to discredit me so completely that if I ever tried to expose their fraud, I would look like a vindictive, unstable woman making up wild lies. I stared at the screen, reading the vicious comments as they rolled in one by one. They were trying to publicly bury me before I could speak. I set the phone back down on the table and looked up at Elias. The ice in my veins solidified into something unbreakable. "Change of plans," I said, sliding the phone across the desk so he could read the post. "We are going to accelerate the timeline." Elias leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. He understood exactly what was required. He promised to have the final dossiers ready by midweek, securely bound, and ready for federal delivery. I left his office, stepping out into the bright Atlanta afternoon, feeling like a phantom in my own life. I drove home, packed a small overnight bag, and checked into a luxury suite at the St. Regis. I could not sleep under the same roof as Julian. I needed pristine focus. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in psychological warfare. My phone buzzed constantly with notifications from the digital onslaught Vivian and Kendra had unleashed. They were executing a flawlessly coordinated whisper campaign. It was not just Facebook posts anymore. It was mass text messages to the church prayer circles. It was hushed phone calls to the country club board members. They were seeding the narrative that the immense pressure of my corporate career had finally shattered my fragile mind. I was being painted as a danger to myself and, more importantly, a financial tyrant to the very family that had so lovingly embraced me. I knew the only way to measure the true extent of the damage was to walk directly into the inferno. I had to face them publicly to see exactly how deep the rot had spread. Sunday morning arrived crisp and clear. I dressed with deliberate, meticulous care. I chose a tailored cream crepe dress, understated pearl earrings, and nude heels. I looked the exact opposite of a woman losing her grip on reality. I looked like a woman who owned the room. I pulled my SUV into the sprawling, palm tree-lined parking lot of Prosperity Tabernacle. The church was an architectural marvel of glass and steel, a massive monument to wealth disguised as worship. As I handed my keys to the valet, I immediately felt the shift in the atmosphere. The valet, a young man who usually greeted me with a bright, enthusiastic smile, avoided my eyes completely. He took the keys in tight silence and jogged away. I walked through the massive double doors and into the grand foyer. The lobby was packed with Atlanta's upper-middle-class elite, a sea of designer suits and expensive custom hats. The moment I stepped onto the polished marble floor, the ambient chatter dropped a noticeable octave. Heads turned, eyes darted in my direction, followed quickly by hands covering mouths, as whispers ignited across the room like a brush fire. I kept my spine perfectly straight and walked toward the sanctuary. The greeters at the entrance, women who had gladly accepted my substantial donations to the children's ministry just a month prior, offered tight, uncomfortable smiles. One of them, a woman named Beverly, stepped forward and placed a heavy, patronizing hand on my arm. "Sasha." "Dear," Beverly said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and faux concern, "we have been keeping you in our most fervent prayers. The Lord heals all broken minds. Just surrender your burdens and stop fighting your husband." I did not flinch. "Thank you, Beverly," I replied, my voice smooth as glass. "My mind is sharper than it has ever been." I walked past her and entered the massive sanctuary. I bypassed the general seating and made my way directly to the VIP section near the front stage. This was the very section my stolen life savings had purchased for Vivian. There they were. The entire fraudulent syndicate. Vivian sat in the center, flanked by Kendra and Darius. Julian sat on the aisle. They looked like the perfect, pious family. Vivian was dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the role of the frail, victimized matriarch to absolute perfection. Julian sat with his head bowed, looking appropriately burdened and deeply spiritual. I slid into the pew directly behind them. Julian stiffened as he caught my scent. He turned around, his eyes widening in genuine panic. He had assumed I would hide in my hotel room in shame. He had fundamentally miscalculated my resilience. "What are you doing here?" Julian hissed under his breath, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the wooden pew. "You need to leave. You are embarrassing yourself and making a scene." I simply smiled gracefully, opening my Sunday program. "I am here to worship Julian. I have so much to be thankful for today." Vivian turned her head slightly, shooting me a glare so venomous it could have stripped paint from the walls. I held her gaze until she was forced to look away, her hands trembling slightly. The service began. The pastor took the stage, and within 10 minutes, it became abundantly clear that Vivian had gotten to him as well. His sermon focused heavily on the themes of wifely submission, the modern dangers of female arrogance, and the spiritual duty of keeping the family unit intact, regardless of a wife's mental failings. He spoke loudly about how true wealth was measured by family loyalty, not bank accounts, and how the modern woman often loses her way when she prioritizes corporate titles over her household duties. Every word was a targeted, calculated strike. The congregation murmured their agreement, casting sideways judgmental glances at me. I sat there for the entire hour, absorbing every insult, every condescending look, and every whispered judgment. I needed to feel the absolute depth of their betrayal. I needed the burning anger to crystallize into pure cold action. When the service concluded, the real performance began. The Sunday tradition dictated that the elite members of the congregation transitioned directly to the Buckhead Country Club for a lavish, exclusive brunch. I followed Julian's car all the way there, driving at a relaxed, unbothered pace. The country club dining room was flooded with natural light filled with the clinking of crystal mimosas and the hum of privileged conversation. As I walked in, the social freeze-out was immediate and brutal. This was the arena where Vivian wielded the most power. She had already arrived and secured a large, prominent table in the center of the room. She was surrounded by the wives of city councilmen, real estate developers, and corporate executives. I walked toward the buffet station to test the waters. A woman named Claire, whom I had personally recommended for a highly coveted position on a charity board just last year, abruptly turned her back as I approached. Two other women gathered their plates and practically sprinted away, actively treating me like a walking contagion. I took a plate and methodically selected my food. Suddenly, Julian was at my side. He grabbed my elbow, his grip tight enough to leave a bruise. He leaned in close, his voice a low, threatening growl. "Stop this right now, Sasha," he demanded, keeping a tight smile on his face for the onlookers. "Everyone knows what you are doing. Mom had to freeze her medical treatments because of your psychotic behavior. People are genuinely worried about your mental health. Let me take you home before you do something you cannot recover from." I looked at his hand on my elbow, then up at his face. He was playing his role flawlessly. To the rest of the room, he looked like a devoted, loving husband, gently trying to guide his sick wife out of a highly stressful public space. He was weaponizing my silence against me, daring me to cause a scene that would instantly validate their narrative. Right on cue, Vivian approached our spot near the buffet. She was flanked by Kendra and two of her most loyal church disciples. Vivian reached out with a trembling hand, her face a mask of tragic manufactured concern. "Sasha, please," Vivian pleaded, raising her voice just enough to ensure the surrounding tables could hear every single syllable. "We love you. We just want you to get the psychiatric help you desperately need. Do not do this to Julian. Do not destroy this family over a nervous breakdown." Kendra chimed in, crossing her arms defensively. "You lock the accounts because you are paranoid, Sasha. You are literally trying to leave our mother homeless and bankrupt over your delusions. You need an intervention." A collective gasp rippled through the nearby tables. Diners completely stopped eating to watch the drama unfold. It was a masterful stroke of social manipulation. If I yelled, if I defended myself loudly, I proved I was crazy. If I walked away silently, I proved I was guilty. They had boxed me into a corner using the heavy velvet ropes of high society etiquette. I looked at Vivian, taking in the expensive silk dress. She wore a garment purchased entirely with my credit card. I looked at Julian, projecting endless patience while secretly laundering my life savings through offshore accounts. I looked at Kendra, dripping in designer jewelry she could not afford, screaming about me making them bankrupt. Finally, I looked at the crowd of onlookers, judging me based on a foundation of spectacular, easily disproven lies. I realized then that words were entirely useless. I could stand in the middle of this dining room and scream the truth until my throat bled. I could explain the shell company, the forged loan documents, the wire fraud, and the tax evasion. It would not matter. This crowd did not care about the truth. They cared about the performance. They cared about the optics. Vivian had given them a soap opera, and they were eager consumers of my destruction. They wanted a villain, and my family had hand-wrapped me and offered me up on a silver platter. Fighting rumors with logic was a fool's errand. I could not out-talk Vivian in a room she controlled, and I was not going to waste my breath trying to convince people who had already decided I was guilty. I gently, deliberately peeled Julian's fingers off my arm. I looked directly into Vivian's eyes and offered a smile so chilling, so utterly devoid of warmth, that she actually took a physical step backward. "You are entirely correct, Vivian," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent buffet area. "I do need to make some major changes for my well-being. Thank you for the absolute clarity today." I set my untouched plate down on the pristine linen tablecloth. I did not rush. I smoothed the front of my dress and walked out of the dining room with absolute precision, my head held high, leaving them to their whispers and their premature victory laps. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully neutralized the threat by ruining my reputation and backing me into a social corner. As I stepped out into the bright afternoon sun and handed my ticket to the valet, my phone buzzed in my purse. It was an encrypted text message from Elias. It contained a single word: secured. I slipped the phone back into my bag, a genuine smile finally reaching my eyes. Julian and his family had chosen to play a game of optics and public humiliation. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted to use material possessions and social standing to validate their lies. I was going to give them a spectacle they would never, ever forget. If they valued material possessions above all else, then I would start by systematically stripping those possessions away piece by piece in the most public manner possible. I pulled out of the country club driveway and dialed a number I had saved earlier that morning. It was time to introduce Kendra to the reality of her least luxury vehicle. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. I confirmed the details of the white Porsche Macan, provided the license plate number, and authorized the immediate repossession. Because the lease was tied directly to my now frozen American Express card, the latest payment had bounced hard. Technically, the dealership had given a grace period, but I was the primary guarantor. I formally revoked my financial backing and requested a voluntary surrender, effectively accelerating the repossession. The agent assured me he would be on standby. I drove straight from the country club to my firm. My office occupied the top 3 floors of a sleek, ultra-modern high-rise in the heart of Buckhead. The lobby was a massive atrium of floor-to-ceiling glass-polished chrome and white marble. It was a space designed to intimidate rival executives and impress billionaire clients. It was not a place for cheap family drama. I spent the next 2 hours at my desk drafting press releases and managing client accounts with a terrifying level of hyper-focus. The adrenaline from the country club had settled into a cold, sustained burn. I was waiting. I knew Kendra's psychology perfectly. After the high of their perceived victory at the brunch, she would feel invincible. She would want to push the knife deeper. She would want to humiliate me on my own turf, proving to her mother and Julian that she was the ultimate enforcer of the family's will. At exactly 2:15, my desk phone buzzed. It was the head of building security. He sounded deeply uncomfortable. He informed me that my sister-in-law was in the main lobby, refusing to leave and creating a significant disturbance. He asked if I wanted him to have her escorted out. I told him to stand down and let her speak. I grabbed my blazer, smoothed my skirt, and walked to the elevator. I sent a single text message to the repo agent waiting in the parking garage across the street. The message was just one word: move. The elevator doors glided open on the ground floor. The scene in the lobby was exactly the kind of trashy spectacle I had anticipated. Kendra was standing near the reception desk wearing a bright pink velour tracksuit and holding a counterfeit designer bag. She was pacing furiously, her voice echoing off the marble walls and drawing the stares of every single public relations, executive junior associate, and high-profile client in the vicinity. "You need to get her down here right now!" Kendra shrieked at the bewildered receptionist. "She is a cold-hearted, vindictive woman. She is literally letting my mother die. She froze the credit cards, and now my mother cannot even pay for her vital medical treatments. Bring Sasha down here so she can face what she has done to this family." I stepped out of the elevator bank, my heels clicking sharply against the stone floor. The sound cut through her hysterical rant. Kendra spun around, a triumphant smirk flashing across her face as she saw me. She thought she had won. She thought bringing the church smear campaign into my corporate sanctuary would break me. "There she is," Kendra announced loudly, gesturing toward me, as if addressing a courtroom. The woman who steals from the elderly. Are you proud of yourself, Sasha? Are you happy knowing Vivian is crying right now because her own daughter-in-law is financially abusing her? Unlock the card immediately. You are embarrassing yourself, and I am not leaving this lobby until you fix this. I walked toward her, my expression completely impassive. I did not raise my voice. I did not look around nervously at my colleagues. I maintained direct, unwavering eye contact. Kendra. I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent lobby. Vivian does not have medical bills. Vivian has a shopping addiction and a severe aversion to honesty. But we are not here to discuss her fictitious illnesses. We are here to discuss your car. Kendra scoffed, crossing her arms defensively. My car has nothing to do with your psychotic breakdown. You are deflecting because you know you are caught. Turn the card back on Sasha. Julian told me to come down here and handle this since you are acting completely out of your mind. Before I could reply, the heavy glass doors of the lobby swung open. A towering man with arms like tree trunks walked into the building. He wore a heavy canvas jacket, steel-toed boots, and a lanyard bearing a towing company ID. He held a clipboard in one hand and a set of heavy industrial keys in the other. He bypassed the security desk and walked directly up to me. "Ms. Jenkins?" the man asked in a booming, gravelly voice. "Yes," I replied, offering a polite nod. "I have the flatbed parked out front," he said, holding up the clipboard. "I just need you to sign the voluntary surrender authorization for the 2024 Porsche Macan. License plate verifies." Kendra uncrossed her arms, her smirk vanishing instantly. "What is going on?" she demanded, her voice losing its aggressive edge and pitching into a nervous squeak. "Who is this?" "This is the repossession agent," I explained calmly, taking the pen from the man and signing the surrender form with a clean, fluid motion. "Since the lease for your luxury vehicle is tied directly to my frozen American Express card, the payments have bounced. I am the primary financial guarantor on that lease. I have formally revoked my backing and authorized the dealership to reclaim their property." "You cannot do that," Kendra shrieked, lunging forward. "That is my car. Julian got that for me for my birthday. It is in my name." I handed the clipboard back to the agent. "Check the paperwork, Kendra." Julian negotiated the lease, but he used my credit profile and my card to secure it. Because he does not have the liquid capital to actually afford a Porsche. Therefore, it is my car, and I no longer wish to pay for your joyrides. The repo agent turned to Kendra, extending a massive, calloused hand. "I need the keys, ma'am. We can do this the easy way, or I can just drag it onto the flatbed right now. But either way, that vehicle is leaving this property." Kendra looked wildly around the lobby. The entire firm was watching. The executives she had tried to shock with her fake outrage were now whispering to each other, pointing at her bright pink tracksuit and the towering repo agent. The humiliation she had tried to inflict upon me had entirely backfired. She was the one being exposed as a fraud in a room full of image consultants. "You are a monster," she spat, tears of genuine panic welling in her eyes. "How am I supposed to get home? How am I supposed to get to work?" "You do not have a job, Kendra," I reminded her smoothly. "And as for getting home, I hear Uber is very reliable." That was the exact advice Julian would give. "I will order you an Uber," I offered graciously. "But first, you need to clean out the vehicle." I gestured toward the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the lobby. Just outside, parked illegally in the fire lane, was the gleaming white Porsche. Backed up directly in front of it, dominating the driveway, was a massive rusted flatbed tow truck with its yellow hazard lights flashing aggressively. The repo agent jingled his keys. "5 minutes, lady. Grab your personal items. If you leave anything behind, it goes to the impound lot and you will have to pay a fee to retrieve it." Kendra's face turned a mottled, furious shade of red. She dug into her counterfeit bag, pulled out the sleek Porsche key fob, and practically threw it at the agent's chest. He caught it effortlessly. She stormed out through the glass doors, marching toward the car. The agent followed closely behind, unlocking the doors and standing guard while she scrambled to gather her belongings. I stood inside the climate-controlled lobby, watching through the glass with several of my colleagues. It was a miserable, frantic display. Kendra yanked open the passenger doors and began pulling out an embarrassing assortment of trash and luxury shopping bags. She hauled out empty coffee cups, crumpled fast food wrappers, a tangle of gym clothes she never actually used to work out, and 3 massive shopping bags from a high-end boutique she had visited just yesterday using my money. She did not have a box or a proper bag to carry it all. She was forced to awkwardly pile the junk into her arms, balancing dirty sneakers on top of designer shoe boxes, clutching gym pants under her chin. Several passing pedestrians stopped on the sidewalk to watch the spectacle. A woman in a business suit walked by and openly scoffed at the mountain of trash spilling onto the pavement. Kendra slammed the car doors shut with her hip. The repo agent immediately climbed into the driver's seat, fired up the engine, and began expertly maneuvering the luxury vehicle onto the steel ramps of the flatbed. The loud clanking of the chains and the roar of the diesel engine echoed off the surrounding skyscrapers. Kendra stood on the curb, her arms overflowing with her embarrassing hoard. She looked utterly ridiculous. The illusion of wealth and status she had projected at the country club was completely shattered. She was just a grifter standing on the sidewalk with a pile of trash, watching her fake life get towed away. I walked out through the glass doors and stood on the pristine concrete of the plaza, keeping a safe distance. The summer heat was oppressive, but I felt perfectly chilled. "The Uber is 3 minutes away," I announced, holding up my phone. "I requested an SUV. You look like you need the cargo space." Kendra whipped her head around to glare at me. Her mascara was smudged, and a stray fast food wrapper fluttered from her elbow to the ground. She was practically vibrating with rage, stripped of her dignity and her favorite toy. "You think you are so smart!" she screamed, her voice cracking as she strained to be heard over the roar of the tow truck securing its payload. "You think taking a car means anything? You think freezing a credit card makes you powerful? You have no idea what is actually happening." I raised an eyebrow, maintaining my absolute calm. "I think repossessing a stolen vehicle is a fairly straightforward transaction, Kendra." She let out a harsh, jagged laugh, shifting the heavy boxes in her arms. She leaned forward, her eyes wide and manic, eager to deliver a crushing blow. "You are pathetic, Sasha," she sneered, her voice dropping into a vicious, triumphant taunt. "You are standing here acting like some corporate queen, but Julian has already outplayed you. He knew you would eventually lose your mind and try to cut us off. That is why he secured the family's future before you even had a clue." She took a step closer, savoring the moment. "You think taking my car hurts Julian already took care of us using your house." She spat the words out like venom, expecting me to collapse in shock, expecting me to beg for an explanation. She thought she was dropping a nuclear bomb, revealing a devastating secret that would shatter my composure. She wanted to watch my face crumble as I realized my entire financial foundation had been leveraged without my knowledge. I simply looked at her. I did not gasp. I did not ask what she meant. I already knew about the forged home equity line of credit. I knew about the $250,000. I knew about the Cayman Islands account. Kendra was not revealing a secret. She was handing me the final necessary piece of evidence. She was confirming that the entire family was aware of the fraudulent HELOC, making her and Vivian willing accessories to federal wire fraud. I let a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. "I know, Kendra," I replied softly, my voice carrying over the rumble of the departing tow truck. "I know exactly what he did." Kendra's triumphant smirk vanished, replaced by a sudden chilling confusion. The Uber pulled up to the curb, honking its horn, but she stood frozen on the sidewalk, staring at me as if she were looking at a ghost. "Have a safe ride home," I said, turning my back on her and walking calmly into the cool, glass-walled sanctuary of my building. The heavy glass doors sealed shut behind me, instantly muting the sounds of the street and Kendra's frantic, humiliated breathing. I walked past the reception desk with measured steps, nodding politely to the security guard who was still staring wide-eyed at the spectacle outside. I stepped into the executive elevator, swiped my keycard, and rode up to the top floor in total silence. When the steel doors parted, I did not go to my desk. I walked directly into my assistant's office, told her to cancel my afternoon meetings, and grabbed my coat. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the country club ambush and the lobby showdown was beginning to metabolize into something heavier, something darker. Kendra's final venomous threat echoed relentlessly in my mind. I had known about the offshore accounts. I had seen the digital shadows of his financial shell games. But her words made the abstract horror sickeningly concrete. My house. The premarital asset I had worked 80-hour weeks to purchase long before Julian had ever entered my life. It was my sanctuary, my ultimate safety net. I drove home in a state of hypervigilance. The familiar suburban streets felt alien, painted with a sinister brush. When I pulled into the driveway, Julian's car was gone. The house was dead quiet. I unlocked the front door, dropped my keys on the console table, and marched straight into his home office. The locked steel filing cabinet sat in the corner, a fortress of secrets he had always vehemently guarded under the guise of client confidentiality. I refused to be locked out of my own life for 1 second longer. I did not care about the noise or the damage. I went straight to the garage, grabbed a heavy iron crowbar from my toolkit, and returned to his office. I jammed the flat-wedged end of the iron bar directly under the lip of the top drawer. I planted my feet, gritted my teeth, and threw my entire body weight backward. The cheap industrial steel groaned in protest, fighting me for a fraction of a second before the locking mechanism snapped with a violent, ear-splitting crack. The drawer violently slid open on its tracks, revealing row after row of meticulously organized manila folders. I did not just look through them. I grabbed the entire drawer, hauled it out of the metal casing, and dragged it down the hallway into the living room. I dumped the contents directly onto the Persian rug. Hundreds of documents, bank statements, tax returns, and legal contracts spilled out in a chaotic mountain of paper. I dropped to my knees and began tearing through the files, tossing aside old utility bills and Julian's meaningless corporate memos. I was looking for the kill shot. My hands flew over the tabs until I struck a thick, heavy folder labeled with the address of my premarital townhome. I ripped the folder open. Inside sat the original property deed, the document that proved I owned the home free and clear. But directly stapled to the back of the deed was a stack of fresh, crisp documents bearing the logo of a massive national bank. It was a commercial loan contract, a home equity line of credit. My eyes frantically scanned the bold print at the top of the page. The approved credit line was $250,000. I felt the breath leave my lungs, entirely punched out of me by the sheer scale of the number, $250,000. I flipped past the terms and conditions, past the amortization schedules, straight to the final signature page. There, sitting on the bottom line, was my name, Sasha Marie Jenkins. I stared at the blue ink. The letters were wrong. The pressure of the pen was heavy, jagged, and aggressive. The loops on the vowels lacked my usual fluid motion. Julian had not just lied to me. He had sat at a desk, practiced my signature, and committed calculated, felonious identity theft to leverage $250,000 of debt against the only asset I truly owned. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and hit Elias on speed dial. He answered instantly, his voice crisp and alert. "Elias," I said, my voice sounding completely hollow in the empty living room. "I need you to run a title check on my townhome right now. Expedite it. Bypass whatever channels you have to." I hear the panic in your voice, Sasha. What did you find? I am sitting on my living room floor looking at a fraudulent HELOC contract, I told him, tracing the forged signature with a trembling fingertip. "It is for $250,000. My name is forged." He collateralized my house. I heard the furious, rapid-fire clicking of Elias striking his mechanical keyboard. The sound was deafening in the silence of my house. 10 seconds passed, then 20. "Sasha," Elias said, his voice dropping into a register of absolute terrifying seriousness. "I am looking at the county clerk registry. The lien was recorded exactly 45 days ago. The bank dispersed the maximum allowable funds a week later." "Where did it go?" I demanded, my fingernails digging into the carpet. More clicking. "I am tracking the disbursement routing now," Elias muttered. "It hit a joint account first, then it was immediately wire transferred out. It followed the exact same path as the stolen savings. 50,000 went directly to Apex Legacy Holdings to finish paying off Darius's criminal lenders, keeping your deadbeat brother-in-law out of a federal penitentiary. And the other 200,000? Elias paused. A sharp exhale of breath hissed through the phone speaker. It went to Vivian. He transferred it into a private wealth management account under your mother-in-law's name. I closed my eyes as the room began to spin. Vivian's designer dresses, the lavish country club brunches, the massive donations to the Prosperity Tabernacle that cemented her status as a platinum-tier socialite. She was not independently wealthy. She was wearing my stolen equity. Julian had leveraged my past, my present, and my future to fund his mother's delusions of grandeur and keep his brother out of prison. Elias, I whispered, staring at the payment schedule attached to the back of the folder. There is a default clause here. I see it on the digital registry. Elias confirmed, his tone turning grim. Julian took out an interest-only loan with a massive initial balloon payment requirement. He has not made a single payment since the funds were dispersed. Sasha, the grace period expires in exactly 30 days. If that account does not receive a minimum payment of $25,000 by the first of the month, the bank will initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings. They will seize your townhome. He was going to let them take it. He had engineered my complete financial execution. Julian knew the foreclosure would destroy my pristine credit rating, bankrupt my personal assets, and completely humiliate me in the public relations industry, where financial integrity was paramount. He had set a ticking time bomb under my life and walked away smiling. Do not panic, Elias ordered, his voice cutting through the rising tide of my shock. You are a victim of severe identity theft. We can file an injunction to freeze the foreclosure, but we must act with absolute precision. We need to loop in the federal authorities immediately. I let the thick stack of forged bank papers fall from my hands. They scattered across the Persian rug, mixing with the debris of a marriage built entirely on deception. The sun was beginning to set outside, casting long, dark shadows across the living room walls. I did not reach over to turn on a lamp. I simply sat there in the encroaching darkness, surrounded by the physical evidence of my absolute ruin. The emotional devastation, the betrayal of a husband breaking his vows, suddenly evaporated. The pain of the infidelity, the sting of Vivian's country club smear campaign, the sheer embarrassment of Kendra's lobby tantrum, it all burned away. What replaced it was a terrifying, crystal-clear calculation. Julian thought he was dealing with a heartbroken, submissive wife who would quietly absorb the debt to avoid a public scandal. He thought I would beg for an explanation, and ultimately accept defeat to protect the family name. He had fundamentally misjudged his target. Elias, I said, my voice hardening into a weapon of cold steel. Draft the federal injunctions. Prepare the identity theft affidavits. Package the wire fraud evidence, the offshore Cayman account details, and the church laundering trail into a single comprehensive dossier. Sasha, if we take this to the feds, there is no coming back, Elias warned quietly. The IRS and the FBI will dismantle his entire family. Darius goes to prison. Vivian loses everything. Julian faces a minimum of 20 years for aggravated identity theft and bank fraud. This ceases to be a civil divorce dispute. I sat in the dark living room, staring at the forged signature that was meant to sign my life away. I know, I replied, a ruthless smile touching my lips. This is no longer a divorce case, Elias. It is a federal wire fraud and forgery case. Burn them to the ground. I ended the call and let the silence of the house wash over me. The time for blind rage had passed. Now came the meticulous surgical execution of my plan. I gathered the scattered documents from the Persian rug, ensuring every page was perfectly aligned, and returned the heavy manila folder to the steel filing cabinet. I pushed the damaged drawer back into its casing, using a heavy hardcover book to quietly pound the bent metal locking mechanism back into a semblance of its original shape. To a casual observer, the cabinet looked untouched. To Julian, who rarely checked the physical files anymore since everything was digitized, it would easily pass inspection. I spent the next hour resetting the stage. I showered, washing away the sweat and grit of the afternoon. I changed into a soft, oversized cashmere sweater and leggings, the exact kind of comfortable, non-threatening attire Julian subconsciously associated with submission. I wiped the sharp, confident makeup from my face, leaving my skin bare and slightly pale. I practiced my expression in the bathroom mirror. The fierce, untouchable PR executive had to completely vanish. In her place, I summoned the ghost of the woman Julian thought he had married, a woman cracking under corporate pressure, desperate for her husband's guidance and terrified of losing her family. I went down to the kitchen and began preparing dinner. I chose his absolute favorite, a slow-roasted herb chicken with root vegetables. The rich aroma filled the house, creating a manufactured atmosphere of domestic tranquility. It was the ultimate Trojan horse. By the time I heard the heavy thud of his car door closing in the driveway, my heart rate was perfectly steady. The trap was set. The front door unlocked and Julian stepped into the foyer. He paused, clearly surprised by the smell of a home-cooked meal. He dropped his briefcase on the console table, his posture stiff, expecting an ambush. He walked cautiously into the kitchen, his eyes narrowing as he saw me standing by the island, pouring a glass of red wine. "Sasha," he said, his voice laced with heavy suspicion. "What is this? Kendra called me in hysterics 2 hours ago. She said you had her car towed right out of your office lobby. She was screaming about you losing your mind." I let my shoulders slump. I did not meet his eyes immediately. I took a trembling breath, channeling every ounce of acting ability I possessed, and looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. I let the glass of wine slip slightly in my hand, setting it down as if I lacked the strength to even hold it. "Julian," I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly on his name. "I am so sorry." He froze. His aggressive stance faltered, replaced by profound confusion. He had expected a screaming match. He had expected me to throw the forged heellock in his face. He was entirely unprepared for an absolute surrender. "What are you talking about?" he asked cautiously, taking a slow step into the kitchen. I covered my face with my hands, forcing a genuine sob from my throat. It was not hard to cry. I simply thought about the absolute devastation of my stolen savings and the depth of his betrayal. The tears were real. The reason for them was the lie. "I think I am having a breakdown," I confessed, my voice muffled by my hands. The stress at the firm, the massive client accounts, the pressure of trying to be the perfect wife and provider. It broke me, Julian. I became so incredibly paranoid. I convinced myself that everyone was out to get me, that your family was trying to ruin me. I froze the accounts because I was terrified of losing control. I had Kendra's car towed because I wanted to feel powerful when I actually feel completely powerless. I lowered my hands and looked at him, letting the tears stream freely down my pale cheeks. "You were right at the country club. I am not well. I have completely lost my grip on reality. Please, Julian. Please forgive me." I watched the transformation happen in real time. The tension drained from his body, replaced by a swelling, intoxicating wave of narcissistic validation. This was his ultimate fantasy realized. His powerful, high-earning wife was entirely broken, sobbing in his kitchen, begging for his forgiveness, and validating every single lie he had planted in the minds of their social circle. He walked over and wrapped his arms around me. I forced myself to lean into his embrace, suppressing the violently nauseating urge to push him away. "Shh, it is okay," he murmured, stroking my hair with a sickeningly patronizing touch. "I told you, Sasha. I told you the corporate world was too much for you. You took on too much responsibility. Your mind just snapped under the weight of it." I know, I sobbed against his chest. "I'm going to unfreeze the accounts tomorrow morning. I will call the dealership and pay the fees to get Kendra's car back. I will apologize to Vivian. I just need you to help me fix this. I cannot do this without you." "You do not have to," he said, kissing the top of my head. His voice was thick with unearned triumph. "I am the man of this house. I will take care of the finances from now on. You just focus on resting." It was a flawless victory for him. He had completely neutralized the threat, secured his control over my assets, and solidified his role as the benevolent savior. He was so drunk on his own ego that he never even considered the possibility that he was being played. We sat down to eat the dinner I had prepared. Julian was in remarkably high spirits. He poured the wine, dominating the conversation with condescending advice about how I needed to step back from my career and focus more on being a supportive partner. I agreed with every word. I nodded eagerly, played the role of the attentive, grateful student, and continuously stoked the fires of his arrogance. After dinner, he stretched and let out a contented sigh. He felt completely invincible. The crisis was averted, his offshore accounts were safe, and his wife was thoroughly subdued. "I need to catch up on some emails," he announced, standing up from the table. "The chaos today put me behind on my client files. I am going to work in the living room for a bit." I smiled softly. "I will clean up the kitchen and join you in a few minutes." He walked into the living room, retrieved his encrypted laptop from his briefcase, and settled onto the sofa. I methodically washed the dishes, keeping a close eye on his reflection in the dark kitchen window. I watched him type in his master password. I watched the screen illuminate his face. He was checking his accounts, verifying that his fraudulent empire was still intact. 20 minutes passed. I dried my hands and walked into the living room, curling up on the opposite end of the sofa with a throw blanket. I picked up a magazine and flipped through the pages, projecting absolute calm. Julian typed for another 10 minutes before his phone buzzed on the coffee table. He glanced at the screen, and I saw a flicker of annoyance cross his face. It was likely Darius or Vivian demanding an update on the situation. "I need to take this," he muttered, closing the laptop screen but crucially failing to log out or power down the machine. His arrogance had made him sloppy. He believed I was entirely broken and technologically inept. He believed he had won. He stood up, grabbed his phone, and walked out of the living room, heading toward the back patio for privacy. The heavy glass door slid shut behind him. I had exactly 5 minutes. I threw the blanket aside and lunged across the sofa. I flipped open the laptop screen. The device instantly woke from sleep mode, bypassing the password prompt because he had not manually locked it. The desktop stared back at me, a digital treasure trove of criminal evidence. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out the encrypted high-speed cloning drive Elias had provided me weeks ago for exactly this kind of emergency. It was no larger than a pack of gum. I shoved the drive into the USB port. The cloning software, pre-programmed by Elias, launched automatically the second it detected a connection. A small black terminal window popped up on the screen, lines of green code scrolling at lightning speed as it began mirroring Julian's entire hard drive. I kept one eye on the terminal window and the other on the glass patio door. Outside in the dark, I could see Julian pacing back and forth, gesturing animatedly as he argued with whoever was on the other end of the line. While the cloning software ran in the background, I quickly opened his email client. I needed to know exactly what was on this machine. I searched for emails sent to Darius. The results populated instantly. My stomach turned as I clicked through the threads. There were dozens of messages detailing the offshore transfers, explicit instructions on how to structure the shell companies, and frantic demands from Darius for more cash to pay off his illicit lenders. I backed out of the email client and opened his primary document folder. There, sitting in plain sight, was a subfolder labeled strictly as Property Docs. I opened it and found the digital motherlode. There were high-resolution scans of my premarital deed blank home equity line of credit applications and several files containing isolated images of my signature. But the most devastating piece of evidence was a single PDF file titled Notary Authorization. I opened it and gasped. It was a digital rendering of a licensed notary public stamp. Julian had not just forged my signature, he had digitally fabricated an entire notary seal to legitimize the fraudulent bank documents. He had stolen the identity of a licensed state official to finalize the theft of my home. The green bar on the cloning software hit 90%. Outside, Julian stopped pacing. He ended the call, shoving the phone into his pocket. He turned around and began walking back toward the patio door. The progress bar hit 95%. Julian reached the patio door and grabbed the handle. 100%. Transfer complete. I yanked the cloning drive from the USB port, shoved it deep into my pocket, and threw myself backward onto the opposite end of the sofa. I pulled the throw blanket up to my chin and picked up the magazine just as the heavy glass door slid open. Julian walked back into the living room, bringing a blast of cold night air with him. He looked annoyed, clearly irritated by whatever conversation he just had. He glanced over at me. I was lazily flipping a page, looking completely unbothered. "Everything all right?" I asked softly, letting a touch of wifely concern enter my voice. "Just family drama." He sighed, walking back to the sofa. Darius always needs something handled. He sat down, flipped open his laptop, and stared at the screen. He suspected absolutely nothing. He had no idea that his entire criminal enterprise was currently sitting inside the pocket of my sweater. "I am going to head up to bed," I said, letting out a manufactured yawn. "I am exhausted." "Get some rest," he replied without looking up from his screen. "Tomorrow is a new day. We will get everything sorted out." "Yes," I agreed, offering him one final docile smile. "We definitely will." I walked up the stairs with measured, deliberate steps. Once I was inside the master bedroom, I locked the door and moved straight into the walk-in closet. I pulled my personal phone from its hiding spot inside a shoebox and plugged Elias's cloning drive into the adapter port. I opened my encrypted messaging app, attached the massive compressed data file, and hit send. The upload took 2 agonizingly slow minutes, but finally the status changed to delivered. A moment later, Elias replied, "File received. Running decryption now." I sat on the floor of the closet, my heart pounding against my ribs. 10 minutes passed in agonizing silence. Then my phone lit up with an incoming call from Elias. I answered immediately. "Sasha," Elias said, his voice entirely devoid of its usual sarcastic edge. He sounded deeply impressed and profoundly serious. "I am looking at the raw data. You got everything. You got the IP routing addresses for the Cayman accounts. You got the direct email threads explicitly proving conspiracy to commit wire fraud with Darius. And you got the digital notary forgery. This is a federal prosecutor's absolute dream." "Is it enough?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the dark closet. "It is a slam dunk," he confirmed. "I am securely forwarding this entire package to my contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division right now. The moment they verify this notary forgery, Julian is facing mandatory federal prison time. Vivian and Kendra will be swept up as accessories to the wire fraud. Darius will be indicted for the original debts." I closed my eyes, letting the reality of the impending destruction wash over me. The entire syndicate was about to be dismantled. "They are dead in the water," Elias continued, the dangerous smirk returning to his voice. "The feds have the digital proof, but they need a physical location to serve the warrants and execute the arrests. We need to catch them all together completely off guard where they cannot destroy their physical phones or deny the charges. We need a stage." I opened my eyes, staring at the dark rows of Julian's expensive suits hanging above me. I thought about Vivian's obsession with high society, her desperate need for public validation, and the country club where she had tried to ruin my life just hours ago. "I have the perfect venue," I replied, my voice cold as ice. "Vivian is hosting the annual Prosperity Tabernacle Charity Gala this Saturday at the Buckhead Country Club. The entire family will be there, dressed in their absolute best, surrounded by everyone they have ever tried to impress." A low whistle came through the phone. "You want the FBI to raid a black tie gala?" "I want a spectacle, Elias," I said, standing up and walking out of the closet. "I want them to lose everything in the exact same room where they tried to destroy me." "Consider it done," he replied. "I will coordinate the timing with the federal task force. Get a stunning dress, Sasha. You are going to want to look your best for this." I ended the call and walked over to the bedroom window, looking out over the quiet, manicured lawns of my neighborhood. Julian was downstairs sleeping comfortably on a bed of spectacular lies, completely unaware that his stolen empire was already burning. Now they just needed the perfect public venue to pull the trigger, and Saturday night was going to be a gala that Atlanta high society would never ever forget. Saturday night arrived with the oppressive humid heat typical of late summer, but inside the grand ballroom of the St. Regis downtown, the air was crisp and thick with the scent of expensive orchids and old money. The Prosperity Tabernacle Charity Gala, newly rebranded this year as the Atlanta Black Excellence Gala, was the premier social event of the season. Vivian had leveraged every stolen dollar and fabricated connection she possessed to secure the absolute center of attention. I walked through the gilded double doors with my hand resting lightly on Julian's forearm. I had spent 4 hours preparing for this exact moment. I wore a floor-length emerald green silk gown that fit like a second skin, paired with diamond drop earrings I had purchased with my first major corporate bonus years ago. I looked wealthy, composed, and completely devoted to the man walking beside me. Julian puffed out his chest as camera flashes illuminated the foyer. He wore a custom-tailored velvet tuxedo paid for entirely by my forged credit line and beamed at the society photographers like a newly crowned king. Kendra and Darius were already inside holding court near the massive ice sculpture centerpiece. Kendra had somehow managed to recover from the Porsche repossession, burying her humiliation under a mountain of borrowed sequins and rented jewelry. She laughed loudly, tossing her head back while clinging to the arm of a local city councilman. Darius stood next to her, looking uncomfortable, in a stiff suit swirling a glass of top-shelf bourbon. He was playing the role of the reformed businessman, the prodigal son returning to lead the church's community outreach programs. Knowing that my stolen home equity had paid off his criminal debts made the sight of him playing the distinguished gentleman physically nauseating. Julian leaned down, whispering in my ear, "You look breathtaking, Sasha. Just follow my lead tonight. Let Mom have her moment." I smiled up at him, softening my eyes to project absolute adoration. "Of course, Julian. Tonight is all about your mother." He kissed my forehead, completely satisfied with his apparent mastery over my mind and finances. We navigated the crowded ballroom, moving past tables draped in gold silk and adorned with towering centerpieces of white roses. Everywhere we went, we were met with hushed whispers and appraising stares. The rumors from the country club brunch had clearly circulated through the elite grapevine. People were watching me closely, expecting a fragile woman on the verge of a psychiatric break. I gave them nothing but poised, polite perfection. Vivian made her grand entrance 20 minutes after the cocktail hour began. She descended the sweeping staircase leading into the ballroom like an aging Hollywood starlet. She wore a spectacular silver beaded gown that caught every ray of light in the room, her neck heavy with diamonds. She was flanked by the senior pastor of Prosperity Tabernacle and the city's mayor. She was the undisputed queen of the evening. When Vivian spotted us, she glided over, extending her hands to Julian. "My beautiful boy," she cooed, kissing both his cheeks before turning her gaze to me. Her eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second, assessing my gown and my calm demeanor, before she stretched her lips into a tight, calculating smile. "Sasha, dear, I am so glad you felt well enough to join us tonight. We were so worried the crowds might be too much for your nerves." "I am feeling perfectly fine, Vivian," I replied, my voice smooth and utterly devoid of malice. "I would not miss seeing you recognized for all your generosity." She searched my face for any hint of sarcasm, found none, and turned her attention back to the politicians hovering nearby. We took our seats at the primary VIP table situated directly in front of the main stage. The table was a curated display of Atlanta's most influential figures. I sat quietly next to Julian, eating my catered filet mignon and listening to the grotesque hypocrisy surrounding me. These were people who built their fortunes on the backs of the working class, currently applauding themselves for donating a fraction of a percent of their wealth to a church that operated more like a hedge fund. Darius sat across from me, sweating nervously through his expensive collar. He kept checking his phone, likely dealing with the fallout of his shadowy business ventures. He had been appointed the head of the church's new urban community fund, a position Vivian had explicitly bought for him, using her stolen influence. The fund was nothing more than a glorified money-laundering vehicle designed to filter untaxed church donations into Darius's pocket. As the dinner plates were cleared, the lights in the ballroom dimmed. A spotlight hit the main stage, and the senior pastor stepped up to the acrylic podium. He spoke for 20 minutes about charity sacrifice and the biblical mandate to build wealth for the kingdom. He painted a picture of a congregation united by faith and financial prosperity, seamlessly blending gospel with rampant capitalism. And tonight the pastor boomed his voice echoing through the massive sound system. We are here to honor a woman who exemplifies the spirit of selfless giving. A woman who has continually sacrificed her own resources to uplift this community. Please welcome to the stage our Philanthropist of the Year, Vivian Jenkins. The ballroom erupted in a standing ovation. 600 members of Atlanta's elite rose to their feet, clapping enthusiastically. Julian stood up, clapping louder than anyone, his face glowing with manufactured pride. I stood beside him politely, bringing my hands together, watching the woman who had stolen my life savings bask in the adulation of a crowd she had essentially bought with my money. Vivian practically floated up the stairs to the stage. She accepted the heavy crystal award from the pastor, wiping a perfectly timed, delicate tear from her cheek. She approached the microphone, looking out over the sea of faces with an expression of profound manufactured humility. I am so incredibly blessed, Vivian began, her voice quivering with practiced emotion. God has been so good to the Jenkins family. We believe that to whom much is given, much is expected. That is why I have dedicated my life to ensuring that the most vulnerable among us have the resources they need to thrive. She spent the next 10 minutes delivering a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. She spoke about her tireless efforts to fund youth programs, her dedication to the church's expansion, and the heavy burden of carrying so much responsibility. She wove a narrative of a matriarch selflessly guiding her flock, protecting her family, and bleeding herself dry for the benefit of the less fortunate. Then her tone shifted. The syrupy humility vanished, replaced by a sharp, calculating edge. She looked directly down at our table. But charity is not a solitary endeavor, Vivian announced, gripping the edges of the podium. It requires a family united in purpose. My son Julian has always understood this. He is the rock of our family, a man of unwavering integrity. The crowd clapped politely. Julian nodded, adjusting his jacket. And tonight, Vivian continued, raising her voice to command absolute silence in the ballroom. I want to use this platform to secure the future of our new Urban Community Fund, a fund managed brilliantly by my other son Darius, designed to keep at-risk youth off the streets. Darius offered a stiff wave from his seat, looking deeply uncomfortable under the sudden spotlight. Vivian's eyes locked onto mine. The predatory gleam was unmistakable. She was moving in for the kill. She wanted to solidify her dominance, humiliate me publicly, and extract more of my money, all in one brilliant sweeping maneuver. I have already pledged $50,000 to kickstart this community fund, Vivian declared loudly. But tonight I want to challenge the next generation to step up. Julian, Sasha, please come up here. The spotlight suddenly swung off the stage and hit our table directly. I was blinded by the intense white light. 600 pairs of eyes instantly turned to look at me. Julian looked entirely shocked, but quickly masked it with a wide, media-ready smile. He offered me his hand, playing the role of the encouraging husband. He thought his mother was simply trying to include us in the photo opportunity. I took his hand and let him lead me through the tables and up the stairs to the main stage. The applause was deafening. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor of the stage as I walked up to the podium, standing directly beside Vivian. The heat from the stage lights was intense. Vivian turned to the crowd, placing a heavy, patronizing hand on my shoulder. Her nails dug sharply into my bare skin. Sasha is a highly successful executive, Vivian announced to the silent room. She and Julian have been so blessed. So tonight, in the spirit of family and giving, I am asking Sasha and Julian to match my pledge. I am challenging them to donate $50,000 right here, right now, to the Urban Community Fund. Let us show this city what the Jenkins family can do when we pull together. The ballroom erupted in thunderous applause. People were cheering, whistling, and standing up. A massive, oversized novelty check was suddenly wheeled out from the wings by two church ushers. It was already made out to the Urban Community Fund. The amount line was left blank. A large black marker was handed to Julian. Julian's face went completely rigid. His media smile froze into a mask of pure panic. He knew the accounts were frozen. He knew he had already drained the equity from my house. He knew he did not have $50,000 to his name. He looked at his mother in absolute terror. Vivian had gone off script. She was so addicted to the public praise that she had forgotten the reality of their financial crimes. She thought she could simply force me to unlock my accounts out of sheer public embarrassment. She thought the pressure of 600 judging eyes would back me into a corner and force me into submission. "Give generously, Sasha," Vivian whispered directly into my ear, her voice dropping to a vicious, threatening hiss under the roar of the crowd. "Write the check, or I will tell this entire room that you are refusing to support starving children because you are a greedy, unstable woman." The crowd's applause began to settle into an expectant, heavy silence. 600 people were waiting for me to take the marker and sign away another $50,000 to Darius's fraudulent slush fund. Julian looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading silently, begging me to play along and save him from this public nightmare. I looked at the giant novelty check. I looked at Julian's terrified, sweating face. I looked at Vivian standing tall and triumphant in her stolen diamonds. And then I looked out at the massive sea of Atlanta's elite. I reached out, gently took the black marker from Julian's trembling hand, and placed it on the podium. I reached out and took the microphone from the stand. I smiled. I had known about the offshore accounts. I had seen the digital shadows of his financial shell games, but her words made the abstract horror sickeningly concrete. My house. The premarital asset I had worked 80-hour weeks to purchase long before Julian had ever entered my life. It was my sanctuary, my ultimate safety net. I drove home in a state of hypervigilance. The familiar suburban streets felt alien, painted with a sinister brush. When I pulled into the driveway, Julian's car was gone. The house was dead quiet. I unlocked the front door, dropped my keys on the console table, and marched straight into his home office. The locked steel filing cabinet sat in the corner, a fortress of secrets he had always vehemently guarded under the guise of client confidentiality. I refused to be locked out of my own life for 1 second longer. I did not care about the noise or the damage. I went straight to the garage, grabbed a heavy iron crowbar from my toolkit, and returned to his office. I jammed the flat-wedged end of the iron bar directly under the lip of the top drawer. I planted my feet, gritted my teeth, and threw my entire body weight backward. The cheap industrial steel groaned in protest, fighting me for a fraction of a second before the locking mechanism snapped with a violent, ear-splitting crack. The drawer violently slid open on its tracks, revealing row after row of meticulously organized manila folders. I did not just look through them. I grabbed the entire drawer, hauled it out of the metal casing, and dragged it down the hallway into the living room. I dumped the contents directly onto the Persian rug. Hundreds of documents, bank statements, tax returns, and legal contracts spilled out in a chaotic mountain of paper. I dropped to my knees and began tearing through the files, tossing aside old utility bills and Julian's meaningless corporate memos. I was looking for the kill shot. My hands flew over the tabs until I struck a thick, heavy folder labeled with the address of my premarital townhome. I ripped the folder open. Inside sat the original property deed, the document that proved I owned the home free and clear. But directly stapled to the back of the deed was a stack of fresh, crisp documents bearing the logo of a massive national bank. It was a commercial loan contract, a home equity line of credit. My eyes frantically scanned the bold print at the top of the page. The approved credit line was $250,000. I felt the breath leave my lungs, entirely punched out of me by the sheer scale of the number. $250,000. I flipped past the terms and conditions, past the amortization schedules, straight to the final signature page. There, sitting on the bottom line, was my name, Sasha Marie Jenkins. I stared at the blue ink. The letters were wrong. The pressure of the pen was heavy, jagged, and aggressive. The loops on the vowels lacked my usual fluid motion. Julian had not just lied to me. He had sat at a desk, practiced my signature, and committed calculated felonious identity theft to leverage $250,000 of debt against the only asset I truly owned. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and hit Elias on speed dial. He answered instantly, his voice crisp and alert. Elias. I said, my voice sounding completely hollow in the empty living room. I need you to run a title check on my townhome right now. Expedite it. Bypass whatever channels you have to. I hear the panic in your voice, Sasha. What did you find? I am sitting on my living room floor looking at a fraudulent HELOC contract. I told him, tracing the forged signature with a trembling fingertip. It is for $250,000. My name is forged. He collateralized my house. I heard the furious rapid-fire clicking of Elias striking his mechanical keyboard. The sound was deafening in the silence of my house. 10 seconds passed, then 20. Sasha Elias said, his voice dropping into a register of absolute terrifying seriousness. I am looking at the county clerk registry. The lien was recorded exactly 45 days ago. The bank dispersed the maximum allowable funds a week later. Where did it go? I demanded, my fingernails digging into the carpet. More clicking. I am tracking the disbursement routing now, Elias muttered. It hit a joint account first, then it was immediately wire transferred out. It followed the exact same path as the stolen savings. $50,000 went directly to Apex Legacy Holdings to finish paying off Darius's criminal lenders, keeping your deadbeat brother-in-law out of a federal penitentiary. And the other $200,000. Elias paused. A sharp exhale of breath hissed through the phone speaker. It went to Vivian. He transferred it into a private wealth management account under your mother-in-law's name. I closed my eyes as the room began to spin. Vivian's designer dresses, the lavish country club brunches, the massive donations to the Prosperity Tabernacle that cemented her status as a platinum-tier socialite. She was not independently wealthy. She was wearing my stolen equity. Julian had leveraged my past, my present, and my future to fund his mother's delusions of grandeur and keep his brother out of prison. Elias, I whispered, staring at the payment schedule attached to the back of the folder. There is a default clause here. I see it on the digital registry, Elias confirmed, his tone turning grim. Julian took out an interest-only loan with a massive initial balloon payment requirement. He has not made a single payment since the funds were dispersed. Sasha, the grace period expires in exactly 30 days. If that account does not receive a minimum payment of $25,000 by the first of the month, the bank will initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings. They will seize your townhome. He was going to let them take it. He had engineered my complete financial execution. Julian knew the foreclosure would destroy my pristine credit rating, bankrupt my personal assets, and completely humiliate me in the public relations industry where financial integrity was paramount. He had set a ticking time bomb under my life and walked away smiling. Do not panic, Elias ordered, his voice cutting through the rising tide of my shock. You are a victim of severe identity theft. We can file an injunction to freeze the foreclosure, but we must act with absolute precision. We need to loop in the federal authorities immediately. I let the thick stack of forged bank papers fall from my hands. They scattered across the Persian rug, mixing with the debris of a marriage built entirely on deception. The sun was beginning to set outside, casting long, dark shadows across the living room walls. I did not reach over to turn on a lamp. I simply sat there in the encroaching darkness, surrounded by the physical evidence of my absolute ruin. The emotional devastation, the betrayal of a husband breaking his vows, suddenly evaporated. The pain of the infidelity, the sting of Vivian's country club smear campaign, the sheer embarrassment of Kendra's lobby tantrum, it all burned away. What replaced it was a terrifying crystal-clear calculation. Julian thought he was dealing with a heartbroken, submissive wife who would quietly absorb the debt to avoid a public scandal. He thought I would cry, beg for an explanation, and ultimately accept defeat to protect the family name. He had fundamentally misjudged his target. Elias, I said, my voice hardening into a weapon of cold steel, draft the federal injunctions, prepare the identity theft affidavits, package the wire fraud evidence, the offshore Cayman account details, and the church laundering trail into a single comprehensive dossier. Sasha, if we take this to the feds, there is no coming back, Elias warned quietly. The IRS and the FBI will dismantle his entire family. Darius goes to prison. Vivian loses everything. Julian faces a minimum of 20 years for aggravated identity theft and bank fraud. This ceases to be a civil divorce dispute. I sat in the dark living room staring at the forged signature that was meant to sign my life away. I know, I replied, a ruthless smile touching my lips. This is no longer a divorce case, Elias. It is a federal wire fraud and forgery case. Burn them to the ground. My mother-in-law is absolutely right. I began, my voice projecting crisp and clear through the massive line array speakers of the St. Regis Ballroom. True wealth is entirely about what you give, and giving is something the Jenkins family knows quite intimately. For example, I recently gave $150,000 of my personal life savings to fund Darius's entirely fabricated real estate LLC. A collective intake of breath rippled through the 600 attendees. The clinking of crystal and silver halted instantly. I did not stop. I kept my grip firm on the microphone. I also gave a $250,000 forged mortgage on my premarital home. A mortgage signed by my husband Julian to keep this pious family draped in designer clothes and country club memberships. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that precedes a catastrophic implosion. I watched the blood drain completely from Vivian's face. Her meticulously applied blush suddenly stood out against skin that had turned the color of ash. Julian reacted exactly as a cornered animal would. The media-trained facade dissolved into raw, unfiltered panic. He lunged across the podium, his hands grasping frantically for the microphone. He grabbed the stem of the mic stand, his shoulder slamming into me, his face twisted in a desperate snarl. "Turn it off!" Julian screamed, abandoning any pretense of dignity. "She is having a psychotic episode. Cut the mic." He wrenched the microphone from my hand, panting heavily, and brought it to his mouth to apologize to the crowd. He opened his mouth to speak, to spin the narrative, to tell the city elite that I was a hysterical woman in need of medical intervention. He spoke, but no sound came out. Up in the sound booth, enclosed in glass at the back of the ballroom, Elias had taken complete control. I had smuggled a small encrypted remote access drive into the AV network port during the cocktail hour, giving Elias unmitigated dominion over the entire digital infrastructure of the gala. The microphone feed was dead. The ambient house music was killed. The only audio left in the room was the ambient murmur of 600 shocked socialites. Then the lights dropped. The ballroom plunged into pitch darkness, save for the massive 40-foot projector screens flanking the main stage. These were the screens meant to display Vivian's tear-jerking philanthropic tribute video. Instead, Elias triggered the payload. A blinding white light illuminated the room as a high-resolution image flashed onto the dual screens. It was not a photo of Vivian serving soup to orphans. It was a scanned copy of the forged home equity line of credit. The document was magnified to 20 times its normal size. My forged signature was displayed in 10-foot letters for the mayor, the city council, and the senior pastor to scrutinize. Beside it, Elias had placed a side-by-side comparison of Julian's actual handwriting, lifted from his own corporate tax returns. The match in pen pressure and stroke angle was undeniable. The crowd erupted. The hushed whispers escalated into a chaotic cacophony of gasps, pointing and murmurs of outrage. The elite of Atlanta were not just watching family drama, they were witnessing a felony broadcast in high definition. Julian stumbled backward, dropping the dead microphone. He stared up at the screen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked down at the VIP tables, searching for an ally, but the very people he had spent years courting were now staring at him with undisguised revulsion. The screen flashed again. The HELOC disappeared, replaced by a complex but easily readable flowchart. Elias had designed it perfectly for the layman to understand. It showed the exact wire transfer routing of the $250,000. The red arrows moved from the fraudulent bank loan directly into the offshore account in the Cayman Islands. A bold red text overlay appeared, account holder Julian Jenkins. Then the arrows splintered, tracking the laundered money back into the United States. One arrow pointed to an account labeled Urban Community Fund. The screen transitioned to show the incorporation documents for the fund, clearly listing Darius Jenkins as the sole managing director, operating without a board of trustees or charitable oversight. I looked down at the VIP section. Darius was no longer sitting at the table. He was already out of his chair, abandoning his half-empty glass of bourbon, backing away toward the emergency exit. He bumped into a waiter, sending a tray of champagne flutes crashing to the floor. The shattering glass echoed like a gunshot, but no one even looked at him. They were too captivated by the screens. The slide transitioned once more. This time, it displayed a relentless, rapid-fire montage of American Express black card receipts. The dates on the receipts perfectly matched the days immediately following the fraudulent offshore transfers. Elias had curated the receipts for maximum humiliation. A receipt from a high-end European boutique flashed on the screen, $10,000 for a silver-beaded gown. The exact gown Vivian was currently wearing. The date was clearly stamped just 2 weeks prior. The crowd literally gasped. Women sitting in the front row turned their heads to stare directly at Vivian's dress. The physical proof of her theft was draped over her body. She was wearing the evidence. Next came the receipts for Kendra's leased Porsche Macan, complete with the dealership signatures proving Julian had illegally leveraged my credit profile. Then came invoices for first-class flights, luxury spa retreats, and 5-star resort bookings across the Caribbean. Every single expense was highlighted, in neon yellow cross-referenced with the dates the money was drained from my premarital equity. The final slide hit the screen and stayed there. It was a summary of the Jenkins family's total fraudulent expenditures over the past 12 months. The grand total was displayed in massive, unforgiving font, $400,000. Stolen from a single woman. The senior pastor of Prosperity Tabernacle, the man who had just handed Vivian her award, slowly backed away from her on the stage. He held his hands up defensively, terrified that the federal fallout of this exposure would splash onto his congregation. The mayor, sitting at the head table, was already whispering furiously to his security detail, signaling them to extract him from the room before any press photographers could snap a picture of him sitting near the Jenkins family. Vivian realized she was entirely trapped. She could not out-talk a 40-foot bank statement. She could not charm her way out of federal wire fraud receipts broadcast to the entire city. Her social empire was burning to ash in front of her eyes, and the smoke was choking her. She resorted to the only weapon she had left in her arsenal of manipulation, the physical crisis. Vivian let out a sharp, dramatic gasp. She brought the back of her hand to her forehead, her eyes rolling back into her head. Her knees buckled with perfectly choreographed grace. She swayed, reaching out blindly, and collapsed onto the polished wooden floor of the stage. She lay there, her expensive silver gown spread out around her, her chest rising and falling in shallow theatrical pants. Mom Julian screamed, rushing to her side. He dropped to his knees, hovering over her, using his body to shield her from the glaring light of the projector screens. "Someone call an ambulance. My mother is having a heart attack. She is dying. Give her some space." It was a desperate, pathetic attempt to hijack the narrative. He wanted the crowd to forget the felony fraud and focus on the poor, stricken matriarch. He wanted sympathy. He wanted an escape route out of the ballroom under the cover of a medical emergency. A few people in the front row stood up, genuinely alarmed by the collapse. The murmuring shifted from outrage to uncertain concern. The societal conditioning to help a fallen elderly woman was strong. Julian was counting on that conditioning to save them. I stood perfectly still, looking down at Vivian's trembling eyelids. I knew she was fully conscious. I knew her heart was beating with nothing but adrenaline and panic. I had played the submissive wife, the silent ATM, and the targeted victim. I was done playing along with their theatrics. I walked to the edge of the stage, bypassing Julian and Vivian entirely. I looked down into the front row and locked eyes with the sound engineer standing near the VIP tables. I gestured sharply toward a spare wired microphone resting on a stand near the steps. The engineer, completely mesmerized by the spectacle, scrambled forward and handed me the wired mic. It was hardwired directly into the backup analog system, completely separate from the digital feed Elias had killed. I clicked the switch on the handle. The sharp pop of the audio feed coming to life echoed through the ballroom. The crowd froze. Julian snapped his head up, glaring at me with a look of murderous defeat. He stayed on his knees next to his mother, paralyzed by the sheer dominance of the moment. I gripped the microphone, my emerald gown shining under the ambient light of the projector screens that still displayed their financial crimes. I looked down at Vivian, who was still committing entirely to her fainting spell, and then I looked out at the 600 elite guests who were hanging on my every breath. "Please keep your seats," I announced, my voice ringing with cold, absolute authority. "There is no need for an ambulance. Vivian is not experiencing a medical emergency. She is simply experiencing the paralyzing shock of accountability." A ripple of shocked laughter and sharp gasps rolled through the back of the ballroom. I had shattered the illusion completely. I turned my gaze back down to Julian. He looked small, insignificant, and entirely ruined. The custom tuxedo could not hide the fact that he was nothing more than a common thief. "I warned you that I needed changes for my well-being, Julian," I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I meant it. You wanted to play games with my livelihood to fund your mother's vanity. You wanted to manipulate the narrative. But you forgot one crucial detail. I control the narrative for a living." I turned back to the audience, sweeping my gaze over the silent crowd. "The authorities have already received this entire digital dossier," I informed them, ensuring my voice carried to the back of the room. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division are currently reviewing the forged notary seals, the offshore routing numbers, and the corresponding American Express receipts. The men and women you are honoring tonight are not philanthropists. They are a highly coordinated fraud syndicate, and their operation ends right now." Vivian's eyes snapped open. The fainting spell vanished instantly. She scrambled into a sitting position, her perfectly coiffed hair disheveled, her face twisted in genuine horror as she realized federal agents were already involved. She had thought this was just a social humiliation. She had not realized I had triggered a criminal execution. "Sasha, please," Vivian begged, her voice a harsh, desperate croak. "Please do not do this. We are family." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing but cold satisfaction. "We were never family." "Vivian," I replied, my voice slicing through the silent ballroom. "You were just a bad investment. And I am finally cutting my losses." I dropped the microphone. It hit the wooden stage floor with a heavy, deafening thud that reverberated through the speakers. I turned my back on the Jenkins family, smoothed the skirt of my emerald gown, and walked down the stairs of the stage. The crowd parted for me instantly, stepping aside as if I were royalty, clearing a wide, unobstructed path directly to the exit. I did not rush. I walked with absolute precision, leaving Vivian and Julian kneeling in the ashes of their destroyed empire, trapped on a stage with nowhere left to hide. I stepped out of the ballroom and into the cool night air. My phone buzzed in my clutch. It was Elias. "Checkmate," the message read. "The feds are pulling up to the loading dock now." I smiled genuinely and deeply and walked out into the Atlanta night. The performance was officially over. I had won. I had won. But as the quiet hum of the luxury vehicle carried me into the Atlanta night, my mind kept replaying the sheer, unadulterated madness that had erupted just minutes before my departure. The arrival of the federal agents had been the final fatal blow, but the moments leading up to those heavy oak doors swinging open were a masterclass in panic. The flawless execution of my plan had triggered a desperation in the Jenkins family that was both pathetic and fiercely volatile. The gala floor had descended into absolute chaos. It started the second Elias flashed the financial evidence across the 40-foot projector screens. The sophisticated veneer of the St. Regis ballroom completely dissolved. The polite whispers of Atlanta's elite morphed into a deafening roar of outrage and disbelief. Kendra was the first to completely snap. The open bar and the crushing weight of public humiliation proved to be an explosive combination. She let out an ear-piercing shriek that cut through the low roar of the crowd. Gathering the heavy rented sequins of her gown, she shoved past a table of stunned city council members and tried to rush the stage. "She is lying!" Kendra screamed, her voice cracking as she pointed a manicured finger directly at me. "She fabricated those documents. It is all fake. She is trying to destroy us because Julian is leaving her. She scrambled up the carpeted stairs of the stage, her high heels catching on the hem of her dress. She stumbled, nearly taking out a massive arrangement of white orchids, but violently caught her balance. Her eyes were wild, her expensive makeup beginning to run. She turned to the audience, waving her arms frantically, begging the city's most powerful people to believe her over the indisputable evidence glowing behind her. "Do not look at the screens!" Kendra wailed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "She is a bitter, unstable woman. My family is built on faith. We are godly people. She is trying to steal our blessing." The response from the crowd was devastating. No one rushed to comfort her. No one offered a murmur of support. They simply stared at her with expressions of profound, unvarnished disgust. A pair of private security guards stepped forward, firmly grasping Kendra by the arms and dragging her back toward the edge of the stage. She thrashed against them, her rented jewelry glittering under the harsh projector light, entirely consumed by her own delusion. While Kendra was making a spectacle of herself, Julian was entirely paralyzed by panic. The sight of his forged signature, magnified to 10 feet tall, had shattered his psychological composure. He abandoned his mother, who was still slumped on the stage floor, and sprinted toward the event coordinator stationed near the audiovisual booth. Julian was sweating profusely. The custom velvet tuxedo that had looked so regal an hour ago now looked like a straitjacket. He grabbed the lead coordinator, a woman holding a headset, and frantically pointed at the massive screens. "Turn them off!" Julian begged, his voice a frantic, breathless hiss. "Cut the power to the projectors. Pull the main breaker. I will pay you whatever you want. Name your price. Turn off those screens right now." The coordinator pulled her arm out of his grasp, taking a sharp step backward. She looked at Julian as if he were carrying a highly contagious disease. "I cannot do anything, Mr. Jenkins," she replied, her voice shaking but firm. "We are completely locked out of the system. Someone has initiated a remote override. We do not have control of the network." Julian looked like a cornered rat. He lunged toward the mixing console, pushing past a terrified technician, and began ripping cables from the soundboard. Sparks hissed from a disconnected monitor, but the giant screens remained brightly lit. Elias had bypassed the local hardware, entirely hardwiring the feed directly into the hotel's emergency broadcast network. Julian was completely powerless. He stood there holding a handful of dead wires, panting heavily as the undeniable proof of his felonies continued to scroll above him. I stood perfectly still in the center of the stage, completely untouched by the frenzy surrounding me. Vivian was sitting on the floor just a few feet away, her silver beaded gown pooling around her. She had dropped her fake fainting act the moment she realized it was not garnering any sympathy. She stared up at me, her eyes wide with terror, finally recognizing the absolute destruction I had engineered. I walked over to the podium and picked up a backup mic resting near the base. I clicked the power switch. A sharp pulse of audio cut through the chaotic noise of the ballroom, instantly commanding the attention of all 600 guests. The room fell into a heavy, expectant silence. "Vivian, congratulations on your philanthropy award," I announced, my voice projecting crisp and clear, carrying an unwavering authority. Vivian flinched as if she had been struck. She looked down at the heavy crystal award that had fallen to the floor beside her. "You will need that good karma." I continued, my gaze locking onto hers with cold precision. "Because this morning, I submitted a full forensic audit to the IRS regarding the $400,000 your family laundered through the church's tax-exempt portal." The acronym IRS hit the room like a physical shockwave. Wealthy socialites, corporate titans, and political figures collectively gasped. Wire fraud was a massive scandal, but the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division was an entirely different level of terror. The elite understood that federal tax evasion charges were virtually impossible to escape. The reaction from the church hierarchy was instantaneous and brutal. The senior pastor, who had spent the entire evening singing Vivian's praises, marched directly toward the front of the room. His face was a mask of furious self-preservation. He signaled to the remaining church elders, who immediately fanned out physically, putting distance between themselves and the Jenkins family table. The pastor snatched a microphone from a nearby stand and turned to the stunned crowd. Prosperity. Tabernacle has absolutely no knowledge of these illicit financial maneuvers. The pastor announced, his voice booming with righteous indignation. We are a house of faith, not a harbor for thieves. The Urban Community Fund was operated entirely at the discretion of Darius Jenkins. As of this exact second, the Jenkins family is formally excommunicated from our congregation. We will surrender all financial records to the federal authorities immediately. Vivian let out a strangled, pathetic cry. Her ultimate shield, her religious standing, had been ripped away in front of her entire social circle. She was completely isolated. The very people she had stolen my money to impress were actively participating in her execution. As the pastor delivered his swift denunciation movement at the back of the ballroom caught my eye, Darius was attempting to execute a quiet, desperate retreat. He knew that his role as the sole managing director of the fraudulent community fund placed him directly in the crosshairs of federal prosecutors. He had abandoned his suit jacket, tossing it onto a nearby chair. Sweat poured down his face, soaking his expensive dress shirt. He hunched his shoulders, keeping his head down, as he tried to slip out the back exit of the ballroom. He navigated through the maze of tables, avoiding eye contact with the furious guests crawling toward the heavy wooden doors leading to the catering hallway. He moved with the practiced stealth of a man who had spent his entire life dodging consequences. He reached the brass handle of the emergency exit, casting one final panicked glance over his shoulder. He thought he had made it. He thought he could slip into the alleyway, disappear into the Atlanta night, and evade the inescapable reckoning. He pulled the door open. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles outside flooded into the dim catering hallway. Darius froze, his hand still gripping the handle. He stared out into the corridor, paralyzed by the sight of the heavily armed FBI task force moving swiftly toward the entrance. His escape route was completely blocked. The authorities had surrounded the entire perimeter of the St. Regis. There was no back door. There was no hidden exit. Darius let go of the door and slowly backed into the ballroom, raising his hands in a gesture of absolute defeat. That was the exact moment the heavy oak doors of the main entrance swung open, and the federal agents stepped into the room to execute their warrants. As I sat in the back of the luxury car watching the city lights blur past the tinted windows, the memory of their stunned, defeated faces brought a profound sense of closure. The chaotic symphony of Kendra's screaming, Julian's panic, Vivian's public excommunication, and Darius's failed escape had orchestrated the perfect finale. They had tried to break me to steal my future and to build their legacy on my ruin. Instead, they had handed me the matches. I had simply struck the flint. I was inches from the grand exit of the ballroom, the cool draft of the foyer teasing my bare shoulders, when a hand clamped down on my arm with bone-crushing force. The grip was brutal, a sharp contrast to the gentle, patronizing touches Julian had performed all evening. He spun me around so violently that the heavy silk of my emerald gown flared out around my ankles. His mask was completely gone. The media-trained, charming philanthropist had vanished, entirely replaced by a cornered rabbit animal. Sweat beaded on his forehead, ruining his perfectly styled hair. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and burning with a toxic mixture of panic and absolute rage. "You think you have won!" Julian hissed, his voice a venomous spray of saliva and terror, keeping his tone low so the gawking crowd could not hear. "You think you can humiliate me in front of my city, in front of my peers, and just walk away?" I did not flinch. I did not attempt to pull away from his bruising grip. I simply looked down at the hand crushing my bicep, then back up to his desperate face. "You just ruined your own life, Sasha." Julian snarled, his chest heaving. "I am going to destroy you in divorce court. I will hire the most ruthless legal team in the state. I will drag your name through the mud, freeze every asset you have left, and leave you with nothing. You are nothing without me. You are a paranoid, unstable woman, and by the time I am done with you, no PR firm in this country will ever touch you again." He still did not understand. Even after the 40-foot bank statements, even after the Cayman Island routing numbers were projected onto the massive screens above us, Julian's colossal arrogance shielded him from reality. He still believed this was a domestic dispute. He still believed he was fighting a civil war. I smiled. It was a slow, terrifying smile that finally made his grip falter. "Julian," I said, my voice eerily calm over the din of the panicked ballroom, "you do not need a divorce lawyer. You need a criminal defense attorney, and unfortunately for you, your accounts are about to be frozen." Before he could process the words, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom burst open with a deafening crash that silenced the entire room. A flood of armed individuals wearing tactical gear and dark windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters FBI and IRSCI surged into the St. Regis. Their heavy boots pounded against the polished marble foyer as they swarmed the exits, instantly locking down the perimeter. Federal agents, the lead investigator, shouted, her voice cutting through the thick, humid air of the ballroom with absolute authority. "Nobody move. Stay exactly where you are." Elias had timed the drop with absolute terrifying perfection. He had waited until the very moment Vivian's financial crimes were fully digested by the elite crowd to give the tactical teams the green light. Julian released my arm as if he had been burned with a hot iron. He stumbled backward, his custom velvet tuxedo suddenly looking like a prison uniform. Two federal agents immediately flanked him, grabbing his arms and forcing them behind his back. "What is this?" Julian stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "You cannot do this. This is a private charity event. I have done nothing wrong. It is a civil matter between me and my wife." I took a slow step toward him as the agent secured his wrists. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in the silence of the room was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. "You really should have read the fine print on that home equity line of credit, Julian," I whispered, ensuring only he and the arresting agents could hear the cold satisfaction in my voice. "That mortgage was underwritten by a federally backed bank. And when you wired those stolen funds from Georgia to your little shell companies in the Cayman Islands, you crossed state and international lines. That is not a civil dispute. That is aggravated identity theft and federal wire fraud. It triggered immediate mandatory federal warrants." The color completely drained from his face. The reality of his situation finally pierced his narcissistic armor. His knees buckled and the two agents had to physically hoist him upward by his armpits to prevent him from collapsing onto the floor. Julian Jenkins, the lead agent, said, stepping squarely in front of him, "You are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Across the room, a chaotic scuffle broke out near the catering exit. The crowd parted violently as two more FBI agents dragged Darius back into the main ballroom. Darius was kicking and thrashing his expensive dress shirt torn at the collar, his silk tie hanging loosely around his neck. He had tried to slip out the back exit the moment the screens lit up with his fraudulent LLC documents, but the perimeter had been locked down by federal authorities long before I ever took the stage. "Get off of me!" Darius yelled, his voice echoing with raw desperation as he slipped on a puddle of spilled champagne. "I did not know the money was stolen. My brother set the whole thing up. Julian gave me the cash. I am just a consultant. I did not sign any bank documents." Even now, the Jenkins brothers were turning on each other. There was no loyalty in their syndicate, only a pathetic scramble for self-preservation. Julian glared across the room at his brother, his face twisting with absolute hatred, but he remained silent, finally heeding his Miranda warning. The chaos on the floor was absolute, but the true spectacle was still unfolding on the main stage. I turned back to the sound engineer's secondary mixing station near the exit doors. I picked up the heavy backup wireless microphone resting on the console and flipped the power switch. The sharp pop of the audio feed coming to life made the entire room flinch. I looked up at the stage where Vivian was scrambling to her feet. "Vivian, congratulations on your philanthropy award," I announced, my voice booming through the overhead speakers, cutting through the murmurs of the stunned socialites. "You will definitely need that good karma." Because this morning, I submitted a full forensic audit to the IRS regarding the $400,000 Your family laundered through the church's tax-exempt portal. The acronym IRS hit the room like a physical shockwave. Wealthy socialites, corporate titans, and political figures collectively gasped, stepping even further away from the stage. The reaction from the church elders was instantaneous and ruthless. The senior pastor, the man who had just handed Vivian the Crystal Award and sung her praises to the high heavens, physically recoiled from her. He turned to the city's mayor, furiously shaking his head and waving his hands in a gesture of absolute denial. "We knew nothing about this," the pastor declared loudly, making sure the surrounding politicians and wealthy donors heard his frantic backpedaling. The church's financial board had absolutely no oversight of Darius's discretionary fund. Vivian Jenkins acted entirely alone. "We are fully cooperating with the federal investigation, and the Jenkins family is formally stripped of all titles and positions within Prosperity Tabernacle." Vivian let out a strangled, agonizing wail. Her ultimate shield, her religious standing, had been ripped away in front of her entire social circle. The very people she had stolen my money to impress were actively participating in her execution. "Do not touch me," Vivian shrieked as a female IRS agent reached for her arms. "I am Vivian Jenkins. I am the philanthropist of the year. I built this church. I built this community. You have no right to treat me like a common criminal." "Turn around, ma'am," the agent ordered, her tone completely devoid of sympathy. Vivian turned desperately toward the VIP tables. She looked at the senior pastor, reaching out her hands in a pleading gesture. Her heavy diamond necklace tangled in the intricate beadwork of her silver gown. "Pastor, please. Tell them who I am. Tell them this is a mistake. Tell them about my donations." The pastor physically turned his back on her, shielding his face from the press photographers who had managed to slip into the room alongside the federal agents. The city's mayor, who had been sitting next to her all night, was already being escorted out a side door by his security detail, abandoning her entirely. She was socially and literally radioactive. "You ungrateful cowards," Vivian wailed, the veins bulging in her neck. "I bought you all. I paid for this entire gala." The agent swiftly spun her around and secured her wrists in handcuffs. The sheer indignity of being restrained in front of the entire country club elite finally broke her. She let out a guttural, agonizing shriek that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. It was the sound of a woman watching her ego, her freedom, and her carefully curated black excellence facade shatter into a million irreparable pieces. The agents began marching them toward the exit. Julian, Darius, and Vivian were paraded down the center aisle, forming a pathetic procession of disgraced royalty. The elite of Atlanta stood on their chairs, holding up their smartphones, recording every single second of the Jenkins family's destruction. The flashes of their cameras illuminated the terror on Vivian's face. As Julian passed me, he refused to meet my gaze. He stared at the floor, his shoulders slumped, his spirit completely and totally broken. Vivian, however, could not help herself. As the agents guided her past where I stood, she stopped, straining against the handcuffs. Her mascara was running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. Her elaborate updo had collapsed, leaving strands of hair clinging to her sweaty cheeks. "You did this?" Vivian spat, her voice a venomous hiss. "You ruined my family. You are a monster, Sasha. A cold, heartless monster." I looked at her, feeling absolutely no pity. My posture was flawless, my emerald gown immaculate. I was standing in the exact spot where she had tried to orchestrate my final public humiliation just minutes prior. "I did not ruin your family, Vivian," I replied, my voice calm and perfectly steady. "I just handed the IRS the receipts. You ruined yourselves." The lead agent gave Vivian a sharp shove forward, ending the conversation and marching her out the heavy oak doors into the glaring red and blue lights of the federal vehicles waiting outside. I stood there for a moment longer, taking in the absolute silence that had descended upon the remaining guests. The elite of Atlanta were staring at me, their expressions a mix of profound awe and genuine terror. They had just witnessed a masterclass in vengeance. They knew without a shadow of a doubt that I was not a woman to be crossed. I turned my back on the ballroom, adjusted my diamond earrings, and walked out into the warm Atlanta night, leaving the shattered remains of their lives behind me. 6 months later, the morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my sleek new corner office in downtown Atlanta. I stood holding a cup of black coffee, watching the city wake up below me. The frantic, suffocating energy that had defined the last year of my marriage was completely gone, replaced by a profound and unshakable quiet. The fallout from the St. Regis Gala had been swift, brutal, and entirely public. When you hand the federal government a meticulously documented trail of wire fraud, identity theft, and tax evasion, they do not waste time building a case. The evidence Elias and I had compiled was a prosecutor's dream. The IRS and the FBI dismantled the Jenkins family syndicate piece by piece, stripping away their stolen assets, their freedom, and their carefully manufactured facade of black excellence. Darius and Julian did not even make it to a trial. Faced with 40-foot high-definition bank statements and an undeniable mountain of offshore routing numbers, their high-priced defense attorneys advised them to take immediate plea deals. They were both currently serving 10-year sentences in a federal penitentiary. The government seized the Cayman Island accounts. The funds were repatriated to satisfy the forged home equity line of credit, and my premarital townhome was completely insulated from their financial wreckage. I owned my sanctuary free and clear once again. The collateral damage to the women of the Jenkins family was equally devastating. Kendra, stripped of the stolen funds that had financed her unearned arrogance, had her Porsche Macan repossessed right in the parking lot of her luxury apartment complex. Unable to maintain her lifestyle, she was forced to declare bankruptcy, pack up her designer bags, and move into a cramped spare bedroom with a distant cousin. Her days of sneering at me across country club dining tables were permanently over. But Vivian suffered the steepest, most agonizing fall from grace. Prosperity. Tabernacle excommunicated her the very morning after the gala, publicly denouncing her actions to protect their own precious tax-exempt status. Without Julian's illicit financial funnel to pay her exorbitant bills, she quickly defaulted on her luxury condo and was unceremoniously evicted. The woman who had once demanded custom floral arrangements and mocked my career trajectory was now working a minimum-wage retail job. She spent her days folding sweaters and ringing up the very same Atlanta socialites she once commanded at a high-end department store she used to frequent as a VIP client. I turned away from the window and set my coffee cup on my immaculate glass desk. Today was the final chore, the ultimate eradication of the Jenkins name from my life. I picked up a thick manila envelope, grabbed my tailored coat, and took the private elevator down to the parking garage. The drive to the Federal Correctional Institution took just under an hour. The imposing razor wire and bleak concrete walls of the prison stood in stark contrast to the crisp, sharp lines of my white designer suit. I walked through the security checkpoints with measured, unhurried steps, feeling absolutely no anxiety. I was not a victim visiting an abuser. I was an executioner delivering the final verdict. A guard escorted me into the sterile visitation room. I took a seat in a hard plastic chair and stared straight ahead at the thick, smudge-covered glass partition. A heavy steel slot sat at the base of the window, designed for passing legal documents. A heavy metal door buzzed open on the other side of the glass. A guard escorted Julian into the booth. He looked a decade older. The custom velvet tuxedos, the expensive haircuts, and the suffocating arrogance were entirely gone, replaced by a shapeless khaki jumpsuit and hollow, sunken eyes. He had lost a significant amount of weight, his shoulders slouching under the crushing, undeniable reality of federal prison. He sat down heavily and picked up the thick black telephone receiver attached to the wall. I picked up my receiver and held it to my ear. "Sasha." Julian breathed, his voice a raspy, desperate croak. "You came. I knew you would come." I placed the manila envelope on the narrow counter in front of me. "I am only here to finalize the paperwork, Julian." He pressed his free hand against the glass, his eyes wide and pleading. The arrogant manipulator who had engineered my financial ruin, who had gaslit me into questioning my own sanity, was completely gone. He was reduced to a begging, pathetic shell. "Please, Sasha," he pleaded, his voice cracking with genuine panic. "You have to help us. You made your point. You destroyed us." "But my mother is suffering. She is working retail. She takes the bus. She can barely pay rent for a tiny apartment. You have the money. You have the power to talk to the judge to ask for leniency to help her out financially. We are family, Sasha. You cannot just leave us to rot like this." I stared at him through the thick glass. He was still trying to play the exact same tired chords, still trying to leverage my empathy, still believing that beneath my armor, I was the soft, accommodating woman he had married. He thought he could extract one last ounce of charity from the wife he had tried to execute. I unclasped the manila envelope and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. They were our final divorce decrees signed by a judge permanently and entirely severing any legal, financial, or personal connection between us. I flattened the papers on the metal counter and shoved them through the heavy steel slot at the bottom of the glass. The papers slid through and hit Julian's side of the counter with a sharp, definitive smack. He looked down at them, his chest heaving with panicked breaths, as he realized this was truly the end. "Your family cost me $400,000, Julian," I said, my voice as cold and hard as a diamond. "My freedom is priceless." I did not wait for his response. I did not give him the satisfaction of a final word or a lingering glance. I placed the phone receiver back on its hook, instantly cutting off the sound of his frantic pleading. I stood up, smoothed the jacket of my white suit, and walked out of the visitation room without looking back. The heavy metal doors of the penitentiary clanged shut behind me, the sound echoing through the sterile lobby as I walked out into the bright, blinding sunlight of the parking lot. The crisp afternoon air filled my lungs, clean and completely untainted by his deception. I walked across the asphalt and unlocked my vehicle. It was a brand new, fully loaded luxury SUV purchased entirely with my own clean, hard-earned money. No forged signatures, no secret offshore accounts, just the undeniable reward of my own relentless labor. I opened the driver's side door and slid into the immaculate leather seat. Before I could press the ignition button, my phone chimed in my purse. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was an email from the CEO of my public relations firm. The way I had handled my own highly publicized crisis, controlling the narrative and emerging completely victorious, had proven my absolute mastery of the industry. I opened the message, my eyes scanning the brief, decisive text. "The board has finalized their decision. Congratulations, Sasha. Your promotion to the C-suite is official. We need you leading the executive team effective Monday morning." I locked my phone and tossed it onto the passenger seat. A genuine, unrestrained laugh escaped my lips, echoing in the quiet interior of the vehicle. The Jenkins family had tried to bury me under a mountain of debt and public humiliation. They had tried to erase my agency and use my life as collateral for their delusions of grandeur. Instead, they had forged me into a weapon. I pressed the ignition button. The engine roared to life with a deep, powerful purr. I shifted the SUV into drive and pulled out of the prison parking lot, leaving the concrete walls and the ghosts of my past completely in the rearview mirror. I merged onto the highway, accelerating toward the city skyline, unapologetic, incredibly wealthy, and entirely free.